Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories, where stories settle softly, where ancient worlds feel a little closer, and where curiosity likes to curl up beside you as the night moves at its own quiet pace. Tonight we're wandering into a place touched by warmth, shaped by light, and remembered in the oldest stories carved into clay. It's a gentle path towards someone who once watched the world from sunrise to sunset, a figure who wasn't just a beam of brightness in the sky, but something far more deliberate. This evening belongs to Utu, the sun god of Sumer, the one who saw everything and carried the idea of fairness long before humans wrote laws or held trials. A very old presence, but tonight we'll meet him in a way that you can drift along with, letting the story move at whatever pace helps you rest. Before we wander any farther, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what the time is in your corner of the world. There's something calming about thinking of people scattered across different hours, each of us meeting at the same moment even though our clocks disagree about what that moment should be called. If you find this soothing, or if these stories help you ease into sleep or simply unwind after a long day, a like or a subscription would mean the world. It helps this calm little space drift to others who might need the same quiet pause you're taking right now. No rush though, just settle in. And now, without hurrying, let's ease into the world that once believed a god travelled the sky every day, not to dazzle or threaten but to make sure the world was fair. A slow beginning. A gentle unfolding of a figure who shaped justice long before human beings had the words to describe it. When ancient Mesopotamia stirred awake thousands of years ago, the people along the rivers understood the rising sun as more than brightness. It came with certainty. It came with a sense that life would continue. Every day had a beginning because something reliable returned. They didn't picture the sun as a ball of fire or a star burning through its fuel. They pictured Utu, a presence who saw all things and moved through the sky not out of instinct or nature but because he wanted to. They looked up and saw intention. They looked up and felt watched, but in a steady and comforting way rather than a fearful one. The world wasn't just illuminated, it felt supervised by something that cared that life wasn't always easy. Sumerians lived in cities of reeds, mud brick, and long shadows cast by the early sun. They needed someone to represent fairness, because their world could be harsh. Floods arrived at awkward moments, crops failed, arguments over water, land boundaries, or trade were common. But each morning, as the sky brightened in the east, they imagined Utu stepping into view again. Light wasn't just light. It was judgment, truth, and clarity. They pictured him as a being who rode across the heavens in a chariot, carrying the sharp, steady gaze that no lie could slip past. The sun saw everything, so Utu saw everything. And that thought alone helped people imagine a world where right mattered. It's interesting to think about how early people didn't separate nature from meaning. Sunlight wasn't just a physical phenomenon. It was a reminder that someone bigger than any king or priest was watching. Not watching in the sense of tallying mistakes or handing out punishment, but watching in a way that gave people an anchor. If you lived in a time when written laws barely existed or weren't always enforced, believing the sun itself was invested in truth probably made the world feel a little safer. You can imagine what it felt like waking up in those early cities. Before the heat rose, before work began, there was that moment where everything was tinted by the soft glow of morning. The stories say Utu emerged then, not as a roar of brilliance, but as a familiar glow easing over rooftops and the curved domes of temples. Even people who didn't pray loudly or visit shrines could still feel that presence. There's something comforting about a god who appears the same way every day, without fanfare, without demanding anything, just rising, just lighting the world so people could see where they were stepping. Utu wasn't just a warm story or a symbol for daylight. In Sumerian myth, he played an active role in the affairs of humans. He helped heroes, he exposed crimes, he watched over oaths. He was thought to bring clarity to conflicts and to show the hidden things that could mislead or confuse. And because of that, people believed fairness wasn't just a human invention, It was something older, something woven into the world itself. When you imagine life without stable courts or consistent rules, the idea that a god of sunlight cared about justice becomes something more than a myth. It becomes a way to feel grounded. The early scribes who etched myths into clay tablets often described Utu as the one who opened every day's path. They wrote about him passing across the sky, but they also wrote about his journey beneath the earth at night, travelling the unseen world to judge spirits, visit the dead, or inspect the places no human ever saw. That idea created a sense that justice wasn't limited to daytime or the living world. It was everywhere, a constant presence, even when people slept or when the sun dipped below the horizon. Their world could be unpredictable, but Utu's cycle never wavered. Something about that regularity shaped early ideas of law. If a god kept to a consistent path, then maybe human behaviour could find consistent rules too. If the sun returned every day, maybe fairness should also return every day. Even the earliest legal codes in Mesopotamia spoke of justice as something guided by divine light. That connection traces back to Utu, long before Hammurabi carved his laws, long before empires rose and fell. The very concept of right and wrong gained form around the steady sight of a god who never looked away. The stories written about him weren't rushed. They moved slowly, describing not just what he did, but why his presence mattered. They painted a world where humans didn't feel alone in deciding what was fair. Even kings, who loved to think of themselves as powerful beyond measure, deferred to Utu. They believed he upheld truth higher than any throne could. A ruler might command armies or oversee cities, but Utu commanded the order beneath all things. His approval mattered more than political strength. You can picture a quiet courtroom in early Mesopotamia, shaded from the heat by woven mats. Two people argue over a boundary or a missing goat or a broken contract. The judge listens, the scribes record, but above all of them shines the belief that Utu sees the truth even if no one else does. That matters in a world where evidence wasn't always available, where stories could be contradictory. People trusted that lies couldn't hide under sunlight. They trusted that even if a clever person deceived them, the god who crossed the sky could reveal what was hidden. And that trust softened the fear that life was unpredictable. There's a calming thought in all of this. The idea that fairness has been part of human imagination for as long as we've built cities or argued over anything. Utu wasn't portrayed as fierce or vengeful. He didn't lash out. He simply illuminated. And that gentle form of guidance shaped something deep in the culture of the ancient world. It's easy to overlook how powerful it is to believe that a cosmic force cares that truth matters. You don't need dramatic miracles or thunderous announcements. A sunrise can be its own kind of reminder. As the story unfolds tonight, we'll follow the presence of Utu through myth, history, memory, and the long path of ideas that travelled from ancient clay tablets all the way into the structure of law that societies still use. That slow line of influence tells us something about how people think when they want to understand justice. They look for something constant, something steady, something that doesn't shift with personal feelings or political pressure. In the earliest days of civilization, that constant was the sun. But before we drift into those deeper tales, it helps to linger just a little longer at the threshold where morning meets the world. Imagine the moment the first rays reached over the marshlands of Sumer. You'd feel the temperature rise bit by bit. Animals would stir, markets would open. People would carry baskets, tools, clay jugs, or reeds for weaving. And above all of them was the presence they believed judged everything with quiet awareness. Utu wasn't a distant star. He was as close as the warmth on their skin. The simplicity of that belief created a comfortable foundation. Even today, when the sun rises, there's a brief quiet space where everything feels clearer than it did the night before. We don't think of a god stepping above the horizon, but the feeling of renewed clarity hasn't changed much in thousands of years. There's something about morning that makes the world make sense again, even if only for a moment. That's the feeling the Sumerians placed inside the figure of Utu. clarity, warmth, a consistent presence that reset the world each day. As we drift forward into the story of his beginnings, into how he became tied to justice, and how humanity shaped its sense of fairness around his movement, let that quiet feeling stay with you, not as something dramatic or mystical, just as the calm certainty that the world has rhythms older than memory, and people have been relying on those rhythms to understand right and wrong since the first days of civilization. The journey ahead through myth and meaning will move gently without hurry, letting each idea settle before the next rises, much like the steady way sunlight unfolds across the horizon. And now, with that warmth beginning to grow, we can slowly step into the earliest moments of his story, when the world was just starting to understand what it meant for light to guide not only the day, but the way people chose to treat one another. When we look back toward the earliest days of Sumer, long before the world had familiar borders, long before cities rose into anything resembling permanence, there is this quiet sense that people were still learning how to describe what they saw. The rivers shaped everything. The mud, the reeds, the slow-moving water. They were the first teachers, and in that landscape, before languages settled into patterns, before stories were organised into the epics we know, there existed a kind of wondering that didn't have labels yet. Dawn wasn't a dawn. Morning wasn't a morning. Light didn't arrive with a name. It simply appeared, spilling into the world with a gentleness that offered structure before structure had a meaning. For the earliest Sumerians, that moment when night softened into something brighter carried significance far deeper than the colour of the sky. They didn't have our scientific framework for what sunlight was. They didn't picture heat rising from a nuclear reaction taking place 90 million miles away. They didn't imagine solar wind, radiation, or orbits. What they saw was something reliable, something that returned no matter how unpredictable the night had been. And that reliability mattered more than anything else, because stability wasn't common in a world still experimenting with agriculture, settlement, and survival. That return of light felt intentional, the world felt guided, and so, in the way humans always do when confronted with something that seems to care, they shaped a presence around it. Not out of superstition or confusion, but out of that intuitive sense that something dependable deserved a face and a name. Before the name existed, the feeling did. Light appeared in the east, and something inside people settled. They understood that whatever came next, harvesting grain, repairing clay walls after a storm, navigating disagreements in the village, could at least happen in the open where things were visible. Visibility meant safety. Visibility meant fairness. You see more in daylight. You lose less. You fear less. This understanding came long before Utu's name appeared on any tablet. Archaeology gives us fragments of those early days, shards of bowls, footprints hardened in old river clay, storage pits with the remains of barley, and occasional symbols etched by hands still figuring out how much a line could say. But it doesn't show the internal experience of those mornings. It doesn't show how people paused to watch darkness loosen its grip, or how they felt a small lift inside their chest because once again the world didn't end overnight. Light walked across Sumer every day at a pace no one controlled, and that alone gave meaning to communities still finding their place in the world. When people finally began shaping stories around that presence, they were doing something more than inventing a god. They were describing a relationship. The light that emerged every day didn't just mark a time, it marked a way of being. Sumerian life was tied to cycles: planting, harvesting, canal building, brick drying, fish migration. The sun was the silent metronome behind all of it. Before writing, before formal religion, before ziggurats rose against the skyline, people looked east and recognized the return of something essential. Eventually, as these early people began settling their minds around language, that light became Utu. But it's important to understand the stage before that name, the stage where the idea existed without the person. In that time, light itself carried responsibility. It exposed footprints near a boundary line to help settle disputes. It revealed a lost animal caught in reeds. It made visible the path of someone returning home late from the marshes. Before Utu judged, the sun judged. Before Utu listened, the daylight listened. Before Utu revealed lies, the brightness did. This early blend between the physical and the moral shaped a lot of what would later become law in Sumer. Before any codified system, fairness was tied to what could be seen. If a claim couldn't be verified in daylight, it didn't feel convincing. If a story didn't hold up under the open sun, it lacked weight. Light was the original neutral witness, even before people said Utu watched them. You can imagine the earlier settlements along the Euphrates and Tigris, clusters of homes built from mud bricks drying under the same light they honoured. People woke and stretched outside their doorways, rubbing the last of the night from their eyes as smoke from breakfast fires drifted into the air. Children ran barefoot on dusty paths. Farmers checked their tools. Fishermen loaded baskets onto reed boats. The light didn't rush them. It didn't instruct them. It simply existed in a way that made each task clearer. Before Utu was a character in myth, he was the shape of certainty. The people weren't thinking of worship at first. They were thinking of their day. But slowly, the feeling that this daily return carried intention began to settle into their culture. If something returns every day without fail, doesn't that mean it chooses to? And if it chooses to, doesn't that mean it may care? These early thought patterns didn't come from fear or dependency. They came from gratitude. When night fell, the world could be overwhelming. Shadows moved strangely. Animals wandered close. Temperatures dropped. Arguments felt heavier without the clarity of daylight. People huddled around small fires, the glow giving shape to their surroundings in ways that weren't entirely comforting. So when morning returned, it felt like a promise, a reassurance that nothing had gotten out of hand, that life still had a rhythm that didn't depend on human control. The first stories that eventually led to Utu's emergence in mythology weren't grand. They weren't epic or dramatic. They were quiet, almost observational. They were attempts to articulate what it meant that the light could reveal things hidden in darkness. Someone would comment that the sun saw a wrongdoing because it made evidence clear. Another person would remark that the sun knew when someone lied because daylight revealed the physical truth. Over time, those observations softened into personification. Something that sees must have a sight. Something that knows must have awareness. Something that returns must have purpose. And something that illuminates must have intent. Long before Utu was described with symbols, attributes, or stories of judgment, he existed as a sense of presence. Even in the earliest eras before temples dedicated to him appeared, people built their homes and fields in reference to where the light reached first. The eastern horizon became more than a direction. It was the place where everything began. People understood that the land woke from that point first. Birds moved earlier in that area. Plants opened toward that side. Food cooked best on that side of the house. The land was a teacher, and light was the way it taught. It's easy to forget now that ancient people didn't have our separation between natural and divine. They didn't divide astronomy from mythology or physics from spirituality. The world wasn't categorized. It was simply lived, observed, and interpreted. When the sun moved across the sky, it wasn't a physical event to them. It was a journey, not as a metaphor, but as a real act. They believed the light was carried, guided, and placed. And because it always behaved predictably, they imagined the one carrying it must be steady, balanced, fair, and attentive. That quality, attentiveness, became one of the roots of Utu's identity. Before his stories speak of justice, before his involvement in heroic tales, before he appears guiding kings or answering prayers, he is simply there, watching, not in a harsh way, not in a threatening way. He is simply the one who sees, and seeing is the foundation of fairness. If you want to understand the origins of justice, you have to understand why being seen mattered. In the earliest human communities, fairness wasn't something enforced through systems. It was something encouraged by visibility. If your neighbour knew everyone could see your actions in daylight, you behaved with a bit more caution, a bit more respect. If disputes could be examined in clear light, they carried less confusion. People associate truth with what is visible for a reason. Those associations began long before writing and law codes. The consistent appearance of light each morning taught people something about pattern, order, and reliability. It set expectations. It helped structure work and rest. And it gave people the sense that the world wasn't entirely unpredictable. There was at least one thing they could trust. That trust became the earlier seed of reverence. Not reverence for light itself, but for what light represented. A force that made the world understandable. The more understandable the world felt, the more people believed something benevolent was guiding it. As villages grew, the stories around that guiding presence grew too. Gradually the idea emerged that this presence wasn't just lighting the world for convenience. It was lighting the world to reveal what was right. People began to associate sunrise with honesty. They believed the light exposed deceit. They imagined that even if someone managed to hide their actions at night, the daytime cycle carried the power to expose them eventually. That idea softened conflicts and shaped behaviour in a way no written rule had to. When Utu finally appeared by name in early inscriptions, he was already fully formed as a guardian of fairness. But his roots reach back into this nameless era, where dawn was simply the return of clarity. In that time, Sumer's earliest people weren't speaking of a god's chariot or his connection to the divine council. They were simply acknowledging that the world returned to order every time light touched the land. And over generations, this daily return took on meaning and personality. Imagine a person sitting outside their home in those early days, grinding grain or preparing clay for bricks. They look toward the horizon and feel the warmth on their hands. They notice that the same warmth reaches everyone else at the same time. The light doesn't choose favourites. It doesn't illuminate kings more than workers. It doesn't honour the wealthy more than the humble. It spreads across the land evenly. That equality mattered deeply. In a world full of differences, disputes and disagreements, the idea that something touched all people equally gave rise to the belief that fairness itself had a divine origin. That belief would eventually evolve into the stories where Utu weighed truth, exposed lies, and served as the cosmic judge. But before any of that, he represented something simpler, that fairness was possible because light didn't discriminate. By the time scribes etched his name into tablets, his identity had already crystallized from centuries of quiet observation and shared experience. Even the way people built their cities reflects this early connection between fairness and daylight. Many temples, doorways and main streets were oriented so the sun would reach them directly. Not to worship light physically, but because the presence of light made the world easier to navigate. A city oriented toward the sun felt like a city oriented toward clarity. A pathway lit by morning felt safer than one left to chance. And these practical decisions wove themselves into belief. The early Sumerians didn't talk about a rigid division between the sacred and the practical. The things that helped them survive became the things that shaped their worldview. Water was sacred because it made life possible. Grain was sacred because it kept communities alive through winter. And light was sacred because it revealed truth and kept fear at bay. Before anyone built a shrine to Utu, they already honoured him by building their days around his arrival. What's fascinating about this early stage is how gentle it is. There are no threats, no warnings, no punishments, no fiery declarations from the sky. Just the soft understanding that the world worked better when it was visible. That simple understanding grew into the belief that the one who carried that visibility was kind, fair, and steady. Utu became a guide not because he commanded obedience, but because he represented something people already relied on: clarity. And as light continued to spill across the land each morning, people continued to interpret that steady rhythm as a form of care. Eventually, villages became towns, towns became cities, and cities began inscribing their beliefs onto clay. Through all of this growth, the idea remained that the world was grounded in something consistent, something that watched, something that cared about truth. And as this sense deepened, the stories around Utu's birth began to take shape, showing how this presence stepped from nameless light into a mythic figure who could walk among gods, guide mortals, and shape the earliest ideas of justice that humanity ever created. Before Utu ever stepped across the sky, before anyone imagined him holding scales or guiding heroes or watching over disputes, he existed as something far quieter. The earliest people of Sumer didn't picture gods the way later civilizations did. They didn't imagine radiant figures standing above the world with blazing weapons or dramatic declarations. They pictured forces that behaved the way the world behaved. Simple, steady, reliable. And Utu's beginning came from that steady rhythm long before he appeared in any myth. The oldest stories reach back to a time when the world was still forming in people's minds. They believed creation wasn't a single moment, but a sequence of acts shaped by the gods they'd eventually name An, Ki, Enlil, Enki, and the rest of the early divine family. In those myths, Utu didn't burst into existence in a flash of heat. He wasn't born in a moment of dramatic cosmic upheaval. His origin was woven gently into the very structure of the world. He appeared when the heavens and the earth were separated, and when order settled into the cosmos. He was the arrival of clarity after a long period where the world was still figuring out its shape. His birth didn't disrupt anything. It completed something. The Sumerians imagined the universe as a layered place, the sky above, the earth in the middle, and the underworld below, with waters everywhere weaving through all of it. In that early silence, the gods who governed these layers took form, each one fulfilling a role that helped sustain life, and became the sky. Ki became the earth. Enlil separated them. Enki shaped the waters and guided creation with cleverness. And within that emerging order, a new presence was needed, someone who could see everything, illuminate everything, and make the world more understandable for both gods and humans. That's where Utu came in. In the creation texts, Utu is described as the child of Nanna, the moon god, and Ningal, his gentle partner who watched over the night with him. It's fitting that the sun would come from the moon in these stories, not because of astronomy, but because of symbolism. The moon represented calm cycles, rhythm, and timekeeping. The sun needed that same careful rhythm, and the Sumerians understood that cycles of light and darkness had to be connected. A child born from the night carried the potential to define the day. Nanna and Ningal were seen as nurturing figures, calm and observant, moving across the sky each night in a way that seemed protective rather than distant. In that sense, Utu's arrival wasn't seen as a dramatic explosion of brightness. It was seen as a continuation of a family that cared for the world in different ways. The moon watched over the night, and its sun would watch over the day. The story felt natural early on. The sun didn't replace the moon. It completed what the moon began. That concept shaped Utu's earliest identity. He wasn't a warrior, he wasn't a ruler, he wasn't frightening. He was simply the next phase of the world waking up. The first rising of Utu was imagined as a moment where light gained consciousness. Dawn didn't just brighten. It became aware, capable of choosing where to look, what to reveal, and how to guide. His birth wasn't a violent beginning, but an awakening, like someone slowly opening their eyes after a long rest. The clay tablets that preserve these myths often speak in straightforward terms. They don't use ornate descriptions. They don't exaggerate. They describe Utu as the great light, or the one who rises from the mountains, or the one who walks daily across the sky. These simple phrases reveal something important. His power wasn't defined by dramatic actions. It was defined by routine. That makes his birth feel different from many other gods in ancient mythologies. While some deities arrived through storms, battles, or cosmic conflict, Utu arrived through consistency. When he took his first rising, according to the stories, the world changed in a way that felt practical rather than mystical. People could see the shapes of the land more clearly. They could understand the boundaries between fields. They could track animal movements. They could plan their work. They could predict the return of light each day. In mythology, that moment was when Utu became fully awake, understanding that the world's survival depended on visibility, fairness, and the ability to see what was happening. In the earliest era, the Sumerians imagined Utu's birth in a setting they knew well, a landscape of marshes, riverbanks, and plains. They didn't picture distant stars or heavenly explosions. They pictured mountains in the east beyond the horizon, the place where the sun seemed to emerge every day. In their minds, that's where Utu began, behind those distant rises, stepping forward into the sky, the way a person might step from behind a doorway. His first rising wasn't a thunderous event. It was familiar. It mirrored what they saw every day. Because of that, Utu felt accessible, not in the sense that people could call upon him casually, but in the sense that he wasn't frightening. He didn't punish without reason. He didn't rush. He didn't overwhelm. His role was to reveal things gradually, at the same pace that light moved across the land. That slow movement shaped how the Sumerians viewed truth. Truth wasn't a dramatic revelation. It was something that arrived steadily over time, the way sunlight slowly reached across the fields each morning. Utu's early myths emphasize that connection. They describe him rising from his father Nanna's domain and moving through the sky with a calm gaze. His parents governed night, dreams, and the quiet movement of time, and he inherited their steadiness, but he had a different purpose. While Nanna observed the night from above, Utu observed the day from within it. He didn't just pass overhead. He walked alongside human activity in a symbolic sense. Everything people did happened under him. That awareness made him the perfect figure to oversee fairness. When telling the story of Utu's birth, the Sumerians didn't frame it as a single event. They saw his arrival as something layered. First there was light, then there was meaning, then there was awareness, then there was intention. The sun didn't become a god immediately. It became one when people recognized that its behavior held significance. That recognition became the mythic moment of birth. A god was born the moment people understood what his daily journey represented. His birth is sometimes described as happening in the heavens, where An, the sky god, placed him among the other deities. Other texts place his beginning in the underworld, suggesting that he rises from beneath the horizon where he judges the dead before emerging into the land of the living. Both versions are symbolic. One emphasizes his divine authority. The other emphasizes his connection to truth in all realms, not just in the world of the living, but in the unseen places as well. This dual origin shaped how people viewed him. A god who sees the living world is powerful, but a god who also sees the unseen one is even more so. The idea that Utu moved through both realms before rising into the sky gave him credibility as a truthful judge. He understood everything because he witnessed everything, even places hidden from human eyes. That comprehension began at his birth. He wasn't born naive. He was born already aware of the structure of the world. It's easy to imagine the first people who told these stories sitting outside their homes, looking at the horizon as dawn approached. They would watch that first strip of brightness stretching across the sky and imagine Utu stepping forward, carrying with him the understanding he gained during the night. Even though they didn't articulate it scientifically, they recognized that morning carried a different feeling than night, a feeling of clarity. And they shaped that feeling into a being who embodied awareness. As Utu took his first rising in myth, the world gained a new stability. He didn't bring storms or floods, or the chaotic forces that many other ancient gods represented. He brought order by being consistent. That consistency made him one of the most trusted figures in Sumerian belief. His birth represented the beginning of a relationship between humans and the sky, not based on fear but on shared understanding. The stories also present his birth as something that aligned the gods themselves. As Utu rose, the Divine Council gained a member who wasn't tied to trickery, emotion, or unpredictability. He wasn't governed by impulse. His rising set the rhythm for the others. Even the gods who commanded storms or governed fate knew that daylight placed structure around their actions. That gave Utu a unique position. His origin placed him at the centre of reliability. Later myths describe him carrying a saw-like weapon to cut through deception, but in these early stories his birth didn't involve tools or weapons at all. His power came simply from appearing, being visible, revealing the world. That sense of effortless authority shaped his role as a judge. A judge doesn't need force, a judge needs clarity. Utu had clarity built into him from the moment he first stepped into the sky. The clay tablets that tell his origin often include him among the first gods who shaped civilization. He didn't bring agriculture or irrigation or crafts, but he brought something equally important, a sense that the world could be understood. His rising each day helped people learn to track time, mark seasons, organize work and build schedules. Without that structure, early cities wouldn't have functioned. Even though his myths emphasize moral clarity, his birth also symbolizes practical clarity. Daylight meant coordination, and coordination meant survival. When people later wrote prayers to him, they spoke to him as someone who had always been present. That feeling was a natural extension of his birth story. A god who rises every day feels eternal, even if myths describe a beginning for him. His first rising didn't feel like the start of something new. It felt like the world aligning with its natural rhythm. His appearance wasn't disruptive, it was welcome. If you read the earliest tablets closely, you can sense how the scribes felt about him. There's no fear in their description, no trembling, no dramatic warnings. They write of him with a tone that feels appreciative, warm, respectful, as if his presence shaped their worldview in a way that was both comforting and deep. His birth carried the promise that truth wasn't hidden forever, that fairness wasn't imaginary, that even in a world full of chaos there was something steady enough to depend on. His earliest worshippers didn't gather in massive temples at first. They didn't carve grand statues. They simply acknowledged him by stepping outside and greeting the day. Later, temples were built in cities like Sippar and Lhasa, but those came long after people had already formed their quiet relationship with him. His first rising existed long before his first shrine. The world itself was his temple at the beginning. When we think about the birth of a god, we often imagine something dramatic. But Utu's beginning teaches something different. Sometimes a god doesn't need drama to be powerful. Sometimes consistency is more meaningful than spectacle. The early Sumerians didn't need explosions of light or cosmic battles. They needed guidance. They needed structure. They needed the feeling that something watched over fairness. The sun rising every day gave them that feeling. And that feeling shaped the mythic moment of Utu's birth. As he took his first journey across the sky, the world beneath him wasn't silent. People walked through fields, tended animals, stitched baskets, kneaded clay, and navigated the early steps of civilization. They didn't see a distant god ruling from the heavens. They saw light that moved with them, watched them, and made their lives easier to navigate. In their minds, that connection meant everything. His birth wasn't just the arrival of a deity. It was the arrival of a companion, a steady presence who shared each day with them. That presence would continue shaping their understanding of justice, responsibility and truth. And as stories about him grew, Utu moved from a simple bringer of light to a guardian of moral clarity. But before he gained titles or responsibilities, he began as something far simpler, the first warm breath of morning taking shape as a god. And in that quiet transformation, the world gained not just daylight but guidance that would stretch across millennia, influencing how people thought about fairness long after the clay tablets were forgotten under layers of dust and time. As Utu settled into his role, the next part of his story began to unfold, where light wasn't just illumination anymore, but the source of judgment, a presence that could witness everything happening under the sky and help shape the earliest ideas of law that people relied on. When Utu first moved across the sky in the early stories, his presence was simply something that made the world visible. But over time, the people of Sumer began noticing that what he illuminated wasn't just the landscape or the work of the day. He illuminated behaviour. He illuminated choices. He illuminated the way people treated each other. And that quiet connection between light and fairness slowly turned into something far more defined. The sun didn't just brighten the land, it brightened truth. And in a world where the earliest civilizations were trying to understand how to live together, truth wasn't just valuable, it was necessary. In the beginning, there were no formal judges sitting in carved wooden chairs. There were no complex legal codes etched into tablets. Disputes were settled by elders, by the person whose home everyone trusted, or by the group that happened to gather nearby. Fairness was something people felt out loud, something decided through discussion rather than doctrine. But even in those early days, people believed fairness wasn't just their decision. It was guided by something watching from above, something that saw what they couldn't always see. And that belief naturally shaped Utu. Light cuts through shadows without effort. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't need to negotiate. It simply reveals. That quality made Utu the perfect figure to become the keeper of law. He didn't judge because he wanted to wield authority. He judged because the act of revealing truth was already built into him. His journey across the sky each day naturally aligned with the idea of fairness. Where he passed, lies had less room to hide. Where he shone, doubt became easier to resolve. The more people understood this, the more they shaped him into a figure who wasn't merely the sun, but the one who understood the difference between what was right and what was wrong. Stories about Utu began to expand beyond his birth and daily path. They started describing how he handled disputes not just between humans, but between gods. Before long, he wasn't just the sun travelling across the sky, he was the judge of heaven and earth, and that title carried weight, not because he wielded force, but because his presence validated truth. In myth, the gods looked to him for clarity. The world beneath looked to him for guidance. He became the bridge between the divine and the human because he witnessed both. One of the most important things about Utu's role as judge is that he didn't punish. The tablets don't describe him striking wrongdoers with bolts of fire or casting them into dark places. His justice wasn't rooted in fear. His power came from the fact that deception couldn't survive in front of him. When you imagine a figure who sees everything, you imagine someone who can't be tricked. Someone who doesn't make decisions based on emotion or assumption. Someone whose fairness comes from witnessing every detail. The earliest Sumerians valued this greatly, because their world depended on trust. Farming communities relied on shared labour, shared water, shared boundaries. If someone took more than their portion, if someone moved a landmarker, if someone broke an agreement, the community could suffer. Fairness wasn't just a moral issue, it was a survival requirement. And the idea that Utu saw everything made people think twice before acting unjustly. Even if no one else noticed, Utu did. That belief alone helped shape the earlier sense of law. When written text finally began mentioning him as a judge, they carried that same tone. They didn't describe him as terrifying. They described him as reliable. They said he established justice in the land. They said he brought truth to the world. They said he watched over the weak. One text even calls him the shepherd of the good, suggesting that fairness wasn't something he enforced, but something he nurtured. This idea made him unique among the gods. In a pantheon filled with deities who governed storms, war, fertility, and fate, Utu governed clarity. That clarity made him a key figure in many myths. Heroes turned to him when they needed guidance. Kings prayed for his approval before making decisions. Ordinary people believed their problems were seen by him, even when no one else listened. His role as keeper of law wasn't symbolic. It shaped real legal structures. When later kings carved their laws into stone, they claimed that Utu inspired them. They believed the principles of fairness they wrote were reflections of his light. They wanted their justice systems to be as consistent as his rising. One of the clearest examples of this appears in the laws of Hammurabi, written long after the earlier stories of Utu. Hammurabi claimed that his right to rule and judge came from Shamash, the Akkadian name for Utu. He carved an image of the god handing him a rod and ring, symbols of authority. Even though this artwork comes centuries after the earliest myths, it shows how deeply rooted Utu's role became. By then, no one questioned who the god of justice was. It was the one who saw all things, the one whose presence revealed truth, the one who started as daylight and became the keeper of law. But Utu's position didn't originate in royal propaganda. It grew from everyday life. Imagine someone accused of stealing grain from a storage room. The elders gather, people talk, voices rise. But then someone says the act happened at dusk or dawn or midday. The light revealed a detail. Perhaps footprints were visible. Perhaps a shadow betrayed movement. Perhaps sunlight exposed something that night would have hidden. Over generations, these small revelations built into a pattern. People trusted Utu because light made things clear without needing judgment from humans. That made him a neutral figure. A neutral figure is rare in mythology. Many gods have preferences, rivalries, grudges, or roles that influence their interactions. Utu simply existed as an observer. He watched the actions of gods and humans alike, not for entertainment, but because his nature made witnessing unavoidable. When myths say he judged the world, they don't mean he weighed souls or punished wrongdoing. They mean he ensured that nothing truly stayed hidden. His fairness came from visibility, and visibility was his domain. The Sumerians understood this so deeply that they linked him with oaths. Swearing by Utu wasn't just invoking his name, it was reminding oneself that deceit would eventually be exposed. Even if a lie held for a day or a week or a season, light would return. The truth had no choice but to appear. This idea carried immense weight in early legal practices. A culture that relies on shared irrigation systems needs trust. A society that negotiates land based on river movement needs clear boundaries. A world where trade depended on honesty needed a witness no one could bribe or manipulate. Utu filled that role naturally. Over time, his judgment expanded into mythic stories, where he helped heroes navigate moral decisions. One of the most famous examples is in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh and Enkidu turn to Utu when they seek to defeat Humbaba, the guardian of the cedar forest. They ask for his favour, not because they want victory, but because they want legitimacy. If Utu supported their mission, then it meant the mission aligned with justice. The Sumerians didn't believe strength alone justified action. They believed fairness had to guide strength, and Utu represented that fairness. Another story describes him helping the goddess Inanna rescue her lover from the underworld. In that myth, Utu doesn't use force. He uses clarity. He reveals what must be done, not through command, but through understanding. That pattern repeats throughout their literature. Utu doesn't act impulsively. He thinks, observes, clarifies. His guidance comes from experience gained through countless cycles of rising, watching, and returning beneath the horizon. His role expanded to the point where people believed he judged not only the living but also the dead. At night, as he moved through the underworld, he was thought to continue observing. This didn't mean he punished spirits. It meant he understood their stories. The Sumerians believed fairness wasn't just for the living, it was universal. A god who saw everything during the day could see everything beneath the earth as well. That continuity made his presence comforting. Death didn't remove someone from the reach of truth. It simply changed where that truth was seen. In many cultures, the sun god becomes a warrior. But in Mesopotamia, Utu became something quieter and more essential. By giving him the role of judge, the Sumerians created a figure who helped stabilize their society long before formal institutions existed. Even after courts developed, even after kings claimed divine approval, people still believed Utu's judgment mattered more than any human decision. His authority wasn't imposed from above. It grew from the way light behaves. The more you read these early texts, the clearer it becomes that Utu's law isn't written law. It's observational law. It's the kind of law that grows from the land itself, the kind that teaches people how to treat each other through the way the world functions. If sunlight exposes lies, then lying is dangerous. If sunlight reveals damage done to a neighbour's field, then fairness demands resolution. If sunlight helps people work together because they can see each other, then cooperation becomes a central part of society. This natural progression shaped every aspect of Utu's identity. His title as judge didn't come from divine decree. It came from the people who lived beneath him and understood how much easier it was to live fairly when everything was visible. His judgment wasn't separate from his nature. It was an extension of it. In the myths, whenever a dispute arises between gods, Utu's involvement brings clarity. He isn't portrayed as biased or emotional. His decisions don't favour his family or his allies. He speaks plainly, guided by the same consistent truth that light provides. When he's described as keeper of law, it doesn't mean he wrote rules. It means he preserved the concept behind them. Rules could change. Kings could rise and fall. Cities could be destroyed or rebuilt. But the principle that truth matters stayed constant. Even in modern times, when people read these ancient texts, they often notice how contemporary Utu's role feels. A figure who doesn't punish but reveals. A judge who doesn't rule through fear but through clarity. A presence that witnesses everything and ensures that honesty eventually surfaces. The earliest civilizations created him not because they needed a god of fire or might, but because they needed someone who represented consistency in a world full of unpredictable forces. People living along the rivers must have felt that deeply. Floods could come without warning. Storms could destroy crops. Disease could spread. But every morning, Utu returned. That reliability made him a symbol of balance. A god who embodies balance is naturally drawn toward fairness. And fairness becomes law when society grows enough to need rules that everyone can follow. Utu's involvement in law wasn't imposed. It was inevitable. As time passed, his influence expanded from myth into civic life. City-states held courts in areas exposed to daylight. Legal ceremonies were often timed with morning. Kings stood before the rising sun when issuing decrees. They believed that aligning themselves with Utu made their rulings more legitimate. Even when empires shifted and new cultures blended into the region, Utu, or Shamash, as he later became known, remained associated with justice. That continuity shows how deeply rooted his role was. Many gods changed identities or faded as culture shifted, but the sun always returned. The concept of fairness tied to light always remained. His judgment transcended eras, languages, and political changes. He became the blueprint for what a fair divine figure should be. And yet, for all that influence, his judgment was never dramatic. The myths don't describe him shouting. They don't describe him thundering from the sky. They show him arriving each day, walking slowly across the heavens, observing, revealing, and then sinking below the horizon to continue understanding what lies beneath. That cycle, steady, predictable, patient, became the foundation of his authority. As his story grew, Utu became more than a god who saw. He became a symbol of balance in a world that needed it. Humans built cities and created hierarchies, but they still wanted something greater than themselves to anchor fairness. They needed a figure who didn't change with politics or mood or circumstance. The sun gave them that, so they gave the sun a name, and then they gave that name meaning. His role as the judge of heaven and earth continued shaping the world long after the Sumerians passed into history. and as his presence influenced later cultures, his stories grew richer. But to understand why he became so central to lore, you have to understand the simple truth behind all of it. People trusted him because light made life easier to navigate. Fairness grows where visibility exists, and Utu was visibility in its most constant form. From that foundation, the story of how he moved through the sky each day gained deeper meaning. His daily path wasn't just a journey, it was the movement of clarity across the world, guiding people and gods alike. And that journey, slow and steady, shaped the next part of his story, where the path he took became as important as the truths he revealed beneath it. Long before people traced constellations or measured angles with tools, they looked up and saw a movement that never failed them. Every morning light appeared in the east, every evening it slipped beyond the west, and in that dependable rhythm they saw not just a pattern but a journey. They didn't imagine the sky as an empty expanse pierced by distant stars. They imagined it as a realm shaped for travel, a place where something with purpose crossed the open space above their homes, fields and cities. From the moment Utu emerged in the earlier stories, he was never still. His identity was tied to movement, not chaotic movement, not hurried movement, just that slow, steady motion that marked every day. People believed he stepped into view at dawn and walked across the heavens with deliberate pace, overseeing everything beneath him without missing a detail. His journey defined the day. His descent defined the evening. His path shaped life before clocks or calendars existed. And because he followed that path without fail, people imagined the sky itself as a kind of road designed for him. The Sumerians described this daily journey with remarkable clarity, even without modern astronomy. They saw the horizon as the boundary between worlds. In the east lay the mountain where Utu emerged. In the west lay the gateway where he disappeared. Everything in between was his domain. When he stepped into the sky, the world came alive. Work began. Trade resumed. Disputes could be settled. Children played. Boats pushed away from the riverbank. Nothing truly began until Utu appeared. His path wasn't imagined as a straight line. The Sumerians pictured him riding a chariot driven by spirited beings, moving in a smooth arc from one side of the world to the other. Some stories describe him guiding the reins himself. Others speak of attendants helping him. But in all of them, his position is constant, always moving forward, always watching, always crossing the same route. That regularity made him dependable in a way few gods in ancient myths were. To them, the sky wasn't infinite. It was a space that could be crossed. The distance between sunrise and sunset felt like a defined region, almost like a field or a road. And Utu moved through it the way someone might walk a familiar path between villages. Because of that, his journey felt personal. They didn't imagine him far away. They imagined him overhead, close enough that his gaze touched everything they did. This closeness mattered. If a god is distant, his influence feels symbolic. But Utu never felt distant. Every time the warmth of morning touched someone's face, or the brightness allowed them to see their surroundings more clearly, they interpreted that as Utu being near. His proximity shaped how they understood his character. A god who passed directly above them each day couldn't ignore their lives. He was present during their work, during their arguments, during their celebrations, during their quiet moments. His journey meant he was always nearby. That nearness also shaped their understanding of fairness. When Utu crossed the sky, he saw everything happening beneath him. In a world where written records were rare and disputes often relied on memory or testimony, the idea that someone witnessed every action made a difference. This wasn't a distant judge who listened from afar. This was a god whose path took him directly above every home and field. His judgment came from observation, not hearsay. His ability to evaluate the world came from walking above it, not sitting apart from it. Because of this, they imagined the sky not as an impersonal backdrop but as the root Utu used to uphold order. The gods governed many aspects of life. But Utu governed clarity, and clarity depended on movement. If he didn't travel, he couldn't see. If he didn't rise, the truth would remain hidden. His journey wasn't a symbolic act, it was essential. The clay tablets describe his route with detail that reveals how closely the Sumerians watched the sky. They knew the sun didn't rise at the same point every day. They saw it shift gradually with the seasons, moving higher or lower, appearing slightly more north or south depending on the time of year. They connected these variations to Utu adjusting his path. It wasn't randomness to them, it was intention. Utu chose his route. He followed patterns he understood deeply. His journey wasn't chaotic. It was governed by rules even the gods respected. And because his journey was governed by rules, the world could rely on him. That reliability shaped everything from agriculture to architecture. People built doorways facing the rising sun because they wanted their homes to greet Utu each day. They organized work around his path because daylight was the safest and most productive time to move through fields or open canals. Even rituals were timed with precision to align with his presence. When Utu reached the highest point of the sky, many ceremonies began. When he dipped toward the west, others ended. His entire identity rested on that motion. In many mythologies, gods perform extraordinary acts to prove their power. Utu proved his through consistency. His journey was his strength. Every day he crossed the sky without fail. Every day he returned. That repetition wasn't dull to them. It was comforting. The world they lived in could be unpredictable, but Utu never was. What made his path even more significant was what lay beneath it. The Sumerians believed he didn't travel alone. Beneath his chariot they imagined two streams, one of light and one of understanding, falling downward as he moved. Light allowed people to see. Understanding helped them make sense of what they saw. These weren't dramatic beams or mystical currents. They were the simple effects of clarity. When light falls on something, you notice details. When you notice details, you understand more. This process, slow and steady, was the foundation of Utu's influence. Because his journey provided visibility, it also provided safety. Animals that roamed at night retreated. Thieves found fewer opportunities. Travel became possible. You could walk from one settlement to another without fear of stumbling in darkness. This shift from night to day wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The path of Utu across the sky-shaped moods, decisions and possibilities. When they imagined Utu returning to the horizon each evening, they didn't picture him abandoning the world. They believed he descended into the underworld, where he continued his journey. His path didn't end at sunset. It simply moved to another realm. At night he travelled beneath the earth, witnessing the unseen world the way he witnessed the land during the day. This continuity gave his role greater depth. He didn't stop observing. He didn't lose sight of what mattered. He simply shifted where he travelled. This nighttime journey turned him into a link between worlds. He connected day to night, life to death, the visible world to the hidden one. That connection made him uniquely qualified to judge. A judge who sees only the living world lacks full understanding. A judge who sees both realms understands everything. Utu had that understanding. His path made sure of it. Some myths describe his nightly journey as challenging. They speak of him travelling through narrow passages, encountering spirits or guiding souls. But even in these accounts, his movement remains steady. He isn't frightened. He isn't overwhelmed. He simply continues along his route, because that route sustains the world. The sun must return. Light must rise again. And for that to happen, Utu must complete his journey no matter how long the night feels. When he reached the eastern horizon again, they imagined him resting briefly before rising once more. That moment, when he paused at the boundary between night and day, was significant. It was the point where understanding gained during the night met the clarity of morning. His first light wasn't rushed. It slowly crept over the land, touching rooftops, reeds, water surfaces and pathways. In that slow arrival, People felt reassured. They believed Utu carried with him everything he learned during the night and used it to guide the day. This interaction between realms also gave him a unique role among the gods. Some deities focused on storms or fertility or fate. Utu focused on continuity. He held the world together by moving through every part of it regularly. Without his path, life would feel disconnected. People wouldn't know how to order their days. Even gods depended on his cycles. Festivals were planned by his light. Offerings were timed with his position. Prayers were whispered when he reached certain heights in the sky. His journey was the silent schedule of the ancient world. The more cities grew, the more this schedule mattered. Large settlements needed structure. They needed predictable moments to begin work, hold meetings, settle disputes, and gather resources. Utu's movement provided that structure. When he reached his peak in the sky, marketplaces grew busy. When he approached the horizon, families returned home. His path wasn't just a mythic journey, it was the foundation of daily life. This deep dependence helped shape the stories about him, reinforcing his role as the keeper of law. If the sun travelled through the whole sky every day, then nothing escaped his gaze. If nothing escaped his gaze, then fairness had a natural guardian. His path made him impartial. He didn't favour one city over another. He didn't illuminate only those who worshipped him. His light touched everyone equally. That equality became the basis for the belief that he upheld justice. Even as later empires absorbed Sumerian culture, the idea of the sun travelling with purpose remained strong. Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians inherited this vision. They kept the same belief. The sun god's journey was the world's anchor. They renamed him Shamash, but his role didn't change. He moved across the sky as judge, witness, and guide. Curiously, many cultures across the ancient world developed similar ideas independently. But in Mesopotamia, the concept took on an especially structured form. They didn't just see the sun's path as a natural phenomenon, they saw it as part of the world's legal framework. Without his movement, there could be no fairness. Without fairness, civilization would collapse. Utu's path was not just the movement of light, it was the movement of order. When you imagine how early people experienced this, it becomes easy to understand why they attach such importance to his journey. Picture someone waking before dawn, listening to the quiet of a city that hasn't yet opened its eyes. They wait, perhaps preparing their tools or sitting beside the doorway. Then, slowly, the horizon brightens. The first light spreads across the ground. It reaches their feet, it reaches their neighbours' homes, it reaches the fields. In that moment, they don't just see the world, they feel seen. And that sense of being seen creates a kind of agreement between the individual and the world itself. It says, today matters, because someone watches. That feeling influenced everything from how they treated each other to how they constructed their cities. They built their temples to face the light. They aligned their doorways with sunrise. They carved symbols of Utu on boundary stones to ensure fairness. They held legal proceedings in open spaces where daylight could fall on everyone present. The path of Utu across the sky shaped their entire concept of justice, not through force, but through visibility. As the centuries passed, his daily route became a symbol in its own right. Artists carved him holding a saw-like instrument used to slice through falsehood. They depicted him stepping through a gate of mountains at dawn. They showed him offering understanding to kings. All of these images were interpretations of the same idea. His path was the world's foundation. His journey provided the clarity that allowed people to live in harmony. There was no need for dramatic stories or violent myths. His power was quiet. It was the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself because everyone felt it every day. A god who arrives each morning and leaves each evening leaves no doubt about his authority. His path was the most predictable movement in the world, and that predictability made him a more effective keeper of law than any deity who relied on storms or battles. As his story continued, Utu's path didn't change, it only gained meaning. Each generation interpreted his journey slightly differently, adding layers of understanding without altering the core. He remained the one who crossed the sky, witnessed the world, and kept truth illuminated. And that role only deepened as myths began describing the objects he carried, the signs he gave, and the ways he helped mortals understand right from wrong. And from this steady crossing of heaven, the next part of his story began to take shape, where the things he carried and the symbols associated with him became essential tools in defining what fairness looked like to the people who lived under his consistent, revealing light. By the time Utu became fully recognized across Sumer as the one who saw all things, people had already connected his daily presence with fairness. They trusted that a god who walked above the land each day would understand how to sort honesty from deception better than anyone else. But as the stories around him continued to grow, his influence didn't stay limited to the simple act of illuminating the world. It deepened into something more structured, something that felt tangible, even though no one could hold it. That something became known as the tablets of truth. In the ancient world, tablets were more than a surface for writing. They were symbols of authority. Anyone who held a tablet held a record. Anything recorded upon clay lasted. When Utu's role as judge expanded in myth, it became natural to imagine him carrying something that reflected the permanence of his decisions. But the tablets of truth weren't just a mythic accessory. They represented the idea that judgment, once illuminated by Utu, couldn't be undone. Once truth entered the world through his light, it stayed. People believed that Utu didn't just witness actions. He recorded them in a way no human court could replicate. The tablets of truth weren't physical objects in their stories. They weren't carved or stored in temples. They were a way of explaining how fairness spread from him to the world. Just as his light touched every corner of the land, the truth he upheld touched situations big and small. His judgment wasn't confined to important matters handled by kings. It extended to disputes between neighbours, promises made between friends, and even the unspoken agreements that helped early communities function. When scribes wrote about these tablets, they described them as containing the principles of honesty, balance, and reciprocity. They weren't written in a language people could read. They existed beyond physical writing, forming a kind of invisible foundation for justice. The stories didn't need to be literal. What mattered was the idea that truth had to come from somewhere. It needed a source. And Utu, with his steady movement across the sky, was the natural place to locate that source. A world that depended on crops, river cycles, and shared resources required trust. Without trust, irrigation canals wouldn't be maintained, boundaries wouldn't be respected, trade wouldn't happen, and in a place where written laws developed slowly, people relied heavily on shared understanding. The tablets of truth helped explain why fairness remained consistent even when human decisions varied. They represented the idea that moral balance didn't depend on rulers or judges alone. It came from something older and steadier than any human authority. When early storytellers described Utu consulting these tablets, they didn't mean he read them like a human reads a text. They meant that his sense of justice flowed from them. They were the reservoir of truth that he carried, the steady guide he used to judge both gods and humans. In a world where memory wasn't always reliable, where disputes often depended on who spoke louder or whose family had more influence, the idea of an impartial divine witness brought comfort. People would gather under the sun's light to settle disputes, believing that Utu's presence ensured the right decision would be made. They didn't wait for signs or miracles. They trusted the daylight to remind everyone involved that truth mattered. The tablets of truth weren't displayed at these gatherings, but they shaped the mindset of those present. They encouraged honesty. They softened arguments. They created a shared expectation that fairness wasn't just a hope, but an obligation. The myths describe Utu holding these tablets not as burdens, but as extensions of himself. They weren't heavy. They weren't complicated. They were simply the embodiment of his clarity. When he travelled across the sky, these tablets travelled with him in a symbolic sense. As he observed the world, the tablets recorded what he saw. As he made decisions in stories, the tablets provided the principles guiding those decisions. When the gods disagreed, Utu's judgment carried the weight of these tablets. His fairness wasn't arbitrary. It was rooted in something constant. The idea of a god carrying the essence of truth is common in many mythologies, but in Sumerian belief, it carried a distinctly practical tone. They didn't describe the tablets of truth with flowery language. They didn't exaggerate their appearance. They didn't present them as mystical artifacts hidden in unreachable realms. They treated them as part of how the world functioned. Utu's judgment worked because truth worked. Light worked. Observation worked. The tablets simply represented those functions. Stories speak of Utu using the tablets to settle disputes among the gods, revealing truths even divine beings tried to hide. These myths show that the principles of truth didn't stop at the human level, they extended to the heavens. If gods disagreed or acted unfairly, Utu served as the one who clarified the situation. He didn't punish them. He didn't command them. He simply reminded them that fairness mattered everywhere. His tablets didn't create truth. They reflected it. This approach to divine justice created a distinct tone in Mesopotamian mythology. Many gods were associated with power, storms, fertility, or war. Utu was associated with understanding. His strength came from his ability to see things as they were, not as others wished they could be. The tablets of truth illustrated that ability. They represented the world as it actually worked, not as anyone imagined it. And in a civilization building some of the earliest forms of law, this distinction mattered. One of the most interesting aspects of his tablets is their connection to time. Sumerians believed that truth didn't vanish. Once an action occurred, it remained part of the world's history. Utu's tablets reflected this idea. They didn't forget. They didn't lose details. Their permanence meant that everything recorded by Utu, every promise, every betrayal, every kind act, stayed known. This created a belief that nothing done in daylight was insignificant. Every action mattered. Every choice left an imprint. This belief didn't frighten people. It grounded them. In a world where forces like floods or famine could seem random, the idea that truth was recorded created a sense of stability. Even if nature behaved unpredictably, fairness had a home in Utu. His tablets provided a foundation that couldn't be washed away by a storm or shaken by a king's temper. They lasted. Many myths describe Utu consulting the tablets when a difficult decision arose. These stories emphasize that his judgment wasn't rash. He didn't act quickly. He didn't rely on personal preference. He took time to understand the situation. The tablets symbolized the careful approach he used. When he judged, he did so with full understanding of the circumstances. That patience shaped how people imagined law. A good judge didn't rush. A good judge didn't assume. A good judge looked for clarity. This approach influenced real Sumerian legal practices. Some tablets used in courts contained not just decisions but explanations. They didn't simply list punishments. They provided context. They showed that fairness wasn't just about following rules. It was about understanding why rules mattered. The influence of Utu's mythic tablets can be seen in the way these early legal texts were written. They aimed for clarity, not intimidation. They aimed to preserve truth, not control people. The myths gave people an example to follow. One story tells of Utu helping resolve a conflict between two gods who disagreed over a boundary in the heavens. Rather than choosing one side immediately, he observed how their actions affected others. He considered consequences. He used the tablets to reveal what outcome aligned best with fairness. This idea of weighing consequences, not just actions, shaped later laws throughout the region. Justice wasn't only about identifying wrongdoing, it was about restoring balance. The tablets of truth also appear in stories about heroes seeking guidance. Before undertaking dangerous journeys, They would look to Utu for direction. They didn't expect him to hand them answers. They expected him to reveal what path aligned with fairness. These stories show Utu's judgment operating not through commands but through illumination. He didn't lead heroes like a traditional god. He clarified their choices so they could lead themselves. This distinction made Utu a comfortable figure to rely on. He didn't demand worship. He didn't impose threats. His role was to keep truth consistent. His presence shaped society through understanding, not power, and the tablets were the symbol of that understanding. As Sumerians developed more complex social structures, the idea of written truth became even more important. Contracts, agreements, and property records began filling their archives. But even as human writing expanded, Utu's tablets of truth remained something greater. Human tablets could be lost, damaged, or misread. Utu's could not. Human judgment could be influenced by wealth, family ties, or fear. Utu's could not. The belief in his tablets created a moral anchor that helped support the earliest legal systems. Some myths describe the tablets as glowing or radiating clarity, not with theatrical brilliance, but with the steady presence of daylight. They weren't magical, they were familiar. Their radiance wasn't meant to intimidate. It was meant to resemble the steady illumination he brought every morning. These depictions reflect the belief that truth doesn't need spectacle, it needs consistency. Utu's tablets were also linked to speech. When he judged, his words carried the weight of truth recorded beyond human hands. When he advised, his voice echoed the clarity of the tablets. Stories portray him as a god who spoke plainly, without unnecessary complexity. He didn't confuse or mislead. His guidance was straightforward because his tablets reflected straightforward reality. This emphasis on plain truth influenced how people told stories, resolved disputes, and taught their children. Clarity became a virtue, honesty became a strength, and Utu, with his tablets, became the guardian of these values. People didn't imagine him holding the tablets above others to claim superiority. They imagined him using them to create understanding. Even in stories where Utu faced challenges or moments of uncertainty, the tablets remained steady. They weren't shaken by events. They weren't influenced by the emotions of gods or mortals. They continued reflecting truth regardless of what happened around them. This resilience reinforced their symbolic importance. Truth wasn't fragile. It didn't crumble under pressure. It endured. The path of the sun across the sky became the physical representation of that endurance. As long as Utu completed his journey, the tablets remained intact. As long as the tablets remained intact, fairness remained possible. Stories about them always returned to the same idea. Truth flows through Utu naturally, the way light flows from the sun. The tablets were the symbol of that flow. Because of this, people believed judgment didn't flow from Utu's hands through command or punishment. It flowed from understanding. When he raised his hand in stories, he did so not to strike, but to reveal. The tablets served as a reminder that justice isn't born from fear, but from clarity. Fairness isn't imposed, it's illuminated. This idea made Utu's judgment deeply human. People understood his fairness because it matched the logic of the world they lived in. When the sun revealed something, they trusted what they saw. When Utu judged something, they trusted his decision. The tablets of truth explained why that trust made sense. They anchored his fairness in something consistent. And as these stories continued to evolve, the image of Utu holding the tablets became a symbol of how justice should move through the world. Slowly, steadily, with understanding, and always in the open, where nothing important could hide in shadow. From this foundation, the next part of his story unfolds naturally, where heroes, rulers, and travellers begin seeking his light directly, hoping to understand not only the truth he carried, but the guidance he provided when their paths grew uncertain beneath the shifting sky. As Utu's place in the world grew clearer, people began to rely on him in ways that stretched far beyond the rising and setting of the sun. His movement across the sky didn't just help them keep track of time or see their surroundings. It gave them a sense that someone dependable was always watching, someone whose clarity could be borrowed when difficult decisions needed to be made. Over time, those seeking direction, whether heroes preparing for daunting journeys, kings wrestling with responsibilities, or wanderers uncertain about their path, began turning their thoughts toward Utu. He became the figure people approached when they needed to understand not only the truth of a situation, but the truth of themselves. His guidance wasn't offered with ceremony. It didn't come through thunderous voices or startling visions. People believed his help came from the simple act of looking toward the light and remembering that clarity existed even when the world felt complicated. Utu's judgment wasn't the kind that overwhelmed. It was the kind that encouraged thoughtful choices. And that made him a natural guide for those who carried burdens heavier than most. The earliest stories describe heroes turning to Utu not because they feared him, but because they trusted him. In a world filled with unpredictable storms, shifting rivers, and complex relationships between gods, they sought out the one figure whose presence was constant. They didn't ask him to change the world for them. They asked him to help them see it clearly. And that simple request shaped many of the most important tales in Mesopotamian mythology. One of the most well-known examples appears in the stories surrounding Gilgamesh and Enkidu. When they planned to journey into the distant cedar forest, a place guarded by the fearsome Humbaba, they didn't turn to a god of war or strength. They turned to Utu. Not because they doubted their ability, but because they wanted to ensure that their quest aligned with justice. They believed that without Utu's support, their courage might be misguided. His approval meant their motive was sound. The strength of their limbs mattered less than the clarity of their intention. That moment in their story reveals something important about how people viewed Utu's guidance. He wasn't a figure who granted victories. He granted understanding. He didn't change outcomes. He helped shape decisions so that the outcomes reflected fairness rather than impulse. Heroes looked to him not to take away risk, but to illuminate the right path through it. This made his role unique among the gods. Many deities offered power. Utu offered insight. In the myths, he listened to Gilgamesh's plea with quiet attention, recognizing the young king's desire not just for glory, but for legitimacy. He didn't answer with force. He answered with permission. And permission from Utu carried weight. It meant the journey wasn't reckless. It meant it had a place in the world's balance. It meant the attempt itself reflected something more than ambition. Once Utu agreed, the path ahead gained structure. Even danger felt anchored by purpose. But Utu didn't guide only kings or legendary figures. He guided wanderers as well, people who lived their lives moving from place to place, encountering new lands where customs differed and familiar landscapes faded behind them. For these travellers, the path of the sun wasn't simply a natural phenomenon. It was a companion. When they woke, they looked east. When they travelled, they moved in directions shaped by the movement of daylight. When they grew uncertain, they paused and watched the sky, believing Utu's steady crossing could help them understand where they should go next. Many stories describe shepherds, merchants, and messengers walking long distances under his light. They believed he noticed them as much as he noticed kings. A god whose guidance depends on visibility naturally becomes the guardian of travellers. Those wandering across open fields or through distant valleys needed a presence that offered reassurance. Utu, moving above them, offered exactly that. His presence didn't change the terrain. It changed how they experienced it. For wanderers, guidance often came as a simple feeling, an internal shift that helped them choose one path over another, make a difficult decision, or recognize that caution was needed. They didn't expect miracles, they expected clarity. And clarity arrived with sunlight. When the land brightened gradually, they felt more confident. When the light exposed obstacles, they knew how to navigate them. When shadows stretched long and the day approached its end, they trusted that Utu's journey beneath the world would continue supporting them in ways they couldn't see. Kings, however, sought Utu's guidance in a different way. Leadership in ancient Mesopotamia required constant decisions. Some decisions affected only the palace, others affected entire cities, and while kings often claimed support from powerful gods like Enlil or Inanna, they turned to Utu when they wanted legitimacy. A ruler supported by Utu was a ruler associated with fairness. Even those who didn't speak his name openly understood that a king who followed Utu's example was one who sought clarity rather than domination. Kings prayed to Utu at dawn. They made offerings to him as the first light reached their temples. They carved his image on stelae and seals, depicting him handing symbols of authority to rulers. These scenes weren't decorative, they were declarations. Utu didn't give kings power, he gave them the moral foundation to use power responsibly. A king who claimed to rule by Utu's light claimed to rule with honesty. This interpretation influenced how they governed. When issuing laws, they aimed to reflect the fairness associated with Utu. When settling disputes, they tried to emulate his impartiality. When planning projects or negotiating peace, they invoked his clarity. A king who lacked fairness risked losing the trust of his people. But a king who aligned himself with Utu gained credibility, not because he was strong, but because he was balanced. Guidance from Utu wasn't just spiritual, it was political. The myths reinforced this. They describe kings going to Utu with questions about justice. They asked whether their decisions aligned with the truth. They asked whether their actions would benefit their people. They asked for clarity because clarity helps avoid mistakes. The tablets often show Utu responding softly, providing guidance rather than command. His direction was never heavy-handed. He simply revealed what needed to be seen. That softness shaped Mesopotamian ideals of leadership. A ruler didn't need to dominate, a ruler needed to understand. Utu's guidance provided that understanding. His influence didn't elevate an individual above others, it elevated decisions above personal ambition. Guidance from Utu was meaningful because it reminded kings that they were responsible for fairness, not just order. In the myths where gods conflict with each other, Utu remains the point of calm. He listens, he considers, he responds with clarity. Heroes admired this, kings depended on it, wanderers trusted it, and ordinary people drew comfort from it. They saw the sun move across the sky and felt that the world's most reliable force carried wisdom that could be borrowed in moments of need. One of the most touching examples appears in a lesser-known story about a young shepherd who lost his way in unfamiliar land. He prayed not for rescue, but for understanding, worried that he would make a wrong decision in a place he didn't know. The story says that as he sat beneath the morning light, he noticed a detail he had overlooked, a subtle path worn by animals leading toward a safer area. It wasn't a miracle, it was clarity. Utu didn't change the world for him. He revealed what was already there. That idea shaped how people interpreted guidance. They didn't expect Utu to intervene dramatically. They expected him to help them see. This principle appears again and again in the mythology. When heroes face uncertainty, Utu helps them understand. When kings fear misjudgment, Utu helps them examine their choices. When wanderers doubt their direction, Utu helps them notice what the world is already showing them. His guidance isn't an outside force imposed on reality, it's the illumination of reality itself. That's why Utu's influence feels so grounded. People didn't need complex rituals to reach him. They needed patience, they needed honesty, they needed to look at their circumstances in the light and acknowledge what they saw. Utu represented that moment when clarity overrides confusion. That moment when you understand something you had struggled with. That moment when indecision settles into certainty. Even when myths describe Utu interacting with other gods, his guidance remains consistent. He doesn't take sides for personal reasons. He evaluates situations based on fairness. If a god acted unjustly, Utu recognized it. If a god acted honorably, he supported it. His guidance wasn't shaped by hierarchy. It was shaped by truth. This neutrality made him a reliable figure even among beings known for their complex relationships. When other gods needed clarity, they consulted Utu. His perspective wasn't clouded by rivalry, pride, or emotion. He carried the tablets of truth, which ensured that his judgment wasn't influenced by personal attachments. Even the divine sought his insight. For humans, the idea that gods relied on Utu reinforced his importance. If even the heavens turned to him for clarity, then mortals felt justified seeking his guidance too. A shepherd, a king, a traveller, a scribe. Anyone could ask for understanding. And because Utu's light touched everyone equally, his guidance belonged to everyone equally. This equality is what made him beloved. Many gods were feared. Many gods were respected. But Utu was trusted. People believed he gave attention to all who needed it, not based on status, but based on sincerity. His guidance wasn't transactional. It didn't require lavish offerings or grand displays. It required honesty. Someone approaching Utu with a genuine desire for clarity was believed to receive help, even if that help came as a simple realization rather than a dramatic sign. This quiet style of guidance influenced how stories were told. Tales centered around Utu often focus on the internal changes experienced by the person seeking help. The moment of understanding, the moment of recognition, the moment of decision, these moments define the narrative. Utu's role isn't to act for the hero, it's to help the hero act wisely. In some myths, Utu appears in dreams, not with vivid imagery but with calm insight. The dreamer wakes with new understanding. They don't wake with instructions etched into their mind. They wake with clarity. This style of guidance mirrors the effect of daylight on a person waking in the morning. Before sunlight reaches them, everything feels uncertain. When the room brightens, details become recognizable. The world becomes understandable. Utu's guidance functions the same way. Travelers experience something similar. As they walked long paths between cities, carrying goods or messages, they often moved at the pace of the sun. When Utu was high, they progressed. When he lowered, they prepared to rest. Their bodies aligned with his movement. Their decisions aligned with his clarity. They believed he kept them safe because he revealed the world around them. Safety came from seeing clearly. For many wanderers, the horizon became the symbol of reassurance. As long as Utu rose there each morning, they believed they weren't lost entirely. They might be far from home, but the sky remained familiar. The journey of the sun reminded them that they still moved through a world governed by consistent forces. Even in unfamiliar terrain, the presence of Utu meant they were not travelling alone. Kings also relied on this sense of consistent presence. When they stood on palace rooftops at dawn to observe the first light, they weren't performing hollow gestures. They were acknowledging the source of clarity that helped them govern. A new day meant new decisions. It meant new challenges. It meant new responsibilities. Watching Utu rise reminded them that clarity existed, that fairness had a foundation, that truth could be known. Some kings sought Utu's favour before making declarations. They believed that aligning their decisions with his guidance would ensure stability. They didn't expect him to eliminate difficulties. They believed he would help them confront difficulties wisely, and that belief shaped how they handled conflicts, taxes, irrigation plans, and diplomatic relationships. Utu's guidance didn't create easy choices. It created informed ones. Heroes, kings, and wanderers shared something important. They all lived within a world where decisions carried consequences beyond themselves. Utu's guidance became the grounding force that helped them navigate these consequences. Heroes faced danger. Kings faced responsibility. Wanderers faced uncertainty. All of them turned to Utu for clarity, because clarity helped them understand the path ahead. Even today, when people read the stories of Utu guiding mortals, the tone remains familiar. It doesn't feel mythic in the sense of larger-than-life drama. It feels human. It reflects moments when a person seeks understanding more than anything else. It reflects that universal desire to see things clearly. Utu's guidance is timeless because clarity is timeless. As the myths continue, Utu plays an even more direct role in shaping the stories of those who needed him, especially those whose innocence required defending, whose struggles demanded fairness, and whose lives depended on the truth being revealed under the steady, patient light he carried across the sky. Across the lands where the earlier cities grew from riverbanks and reed marshes, people carried a quiet belief that innocence carried a different weight beneath the light than guilt did. They lived in a world where fairness often depended on voices being heard clearly, memories being reliable, and communities having the patience to untangle disagreements without losing trust. But those who didn't have power, those who didn't have influence, and those whose stories weren't easy to defend leaned on something beyond human judgment. They leaned on Utu. They leaned on the idea that sunlight itself carried a kind of mercy, a kind of gentle firmness that helped protect people who couldn't protect themselves. When myths describe Utu watching over the innocent, they don't present dramatic scenes of intervention. They don't show him descending to punish the guilty with fire or commanding storms to expose wrongdoing. Instead, they portray a soft but unwavering presence, a presence that simply doesn't allow lies to remain comfortable under its gaze. The kindness attributed to Utu isn't sentimental, it's practical. It's rooted in the belief that clarity helps the vulnerable more than it helps the powerful. People who seek fairness, who need their stories understood, feel safer when the world is clearly illuminated. The earliest myths often begin with simple situations: a dispute in a small village, a shepherd accused of harming animals he didn't touch, a young woman blamed for an event she couldn't have controlled, a traveller held responsible for a theft he didn't commit. These stories always unfold the same way. The community listens, confusion builds, and people begin to worry that the wrong conclusion might be reached. When this happens, someone invokes Utu, not as a fallback for miracles, but as a reminder that clarity wins over confusion when daylight is present. These stories reflect everyday life more than grand epics. They show people using sunlight as a tool. When a dispute arises, they bring everyone outside. They let the morning glow reveal footprints, markings, or objects overlooked in the dark. They let Utu's journey overhead provide perspective. This wasn't superstition. It was an early understanding of how visibility changes understanding. But because they saw the sun as Utu's form, they interpreted these moments as acts of mercy. The myths expand these ideas into symbolic narratives. They describe Utu listening to those who couldn't defend themselves effectively. They describe him watching quietly as people argued, letting the truth reveal itself without confrontation. His mercy didn't arrive through loud proclamations. It arrived through the slow unfolding of understanding. The myths say he favoured the honest, not because he chose sides, but because the honest stood more comfortably in the light. One story tells of a young labourer accused of damaging an irrigation canal. The canal supplied water to several farms, and its collapse caused significant loss. The community turned on him quickly, assuming he had been careless. He didn't have the social standing to defend himself. He didn't own land or have family influence. He only had his sincerity, which wasn't enough to sway the anger rising around him. The story says he prayed to Utu as the sun rose, asking not for rescue but for clarity. And as the light grew, people noticed evidence they had missed. Marks on the ground that showed a large animal had weakened the structure the night before. The young man was cleared without Utu speaking a word. The myth doesn't frame this as a miracle. It frames it as the natural result of truth meeting daylight. This pattern repeats again and again. Innocence is preserved not through dramatic intervention, but through gradual understanding. If someone is wrongly accused, the truth eventually reveals itself when sunlight touches the details surrounding the event. The myths emphasize that Utu doesn't favor the vulnerable because they are weak. He favors them because clarity naturally serves those who haven't hidden anything. Another story describes a merchant accused of cheating travelers with faulty goods. His reputation collapses overnight. Even his family doubts him. But the myth says Utu watched him quietly, waiting until the right moment. The next morning, sunlight exposed a flaw in the storage area where rodents had chewed into containers, causing damage that mimicked intentional fraud. This wasn't a miracle, it was observation. The community apologized, recognizing their anger had moved faster than their understanding. Utu didn't intervene dramatically. He simply made sure the truth couldn't stay hidden. The myths often focus on these ordinary cases because they reflect the daily struggles people faced. Heroes and kings appear in Utu's stories, but ordinary people needed his clarity the most. When someone lacked the voice or power to defend themselves, they believed Utu would do it through the natural movement of the day. His mercy shaped how they structured their society. They learned to listen more carefully. They learned to postpone judgment until daylight. They learned to let visibility guide conclusions instead of emotion. These values influenced real practices. Many early legal proceedings took place in open courtyards or outdoor areas where sunlight touched everyone involved. This wasn't accidental. It reflected their belief that fairness required openness. If Utu's light didn't fall on the situation, people felt uneasy. They thought truth worked better in brightness. Darkness symbolized confusion, not wrongdoing, but confusion alone could destroy trust. These practices made justice less about fear and more about communal understanding. The myths also speak of Utu's mercy with children. In one old story, a young boy is accused of breaking a ceremonial object in a temple. He is frightened, knowing his word carries no weight. The elders gather to question him, but he remains quiet, overwhelmed. According to the tale, Utu's light falls through the temple entrance in a way that reveals the object was weakened by age, not by the boy's hand. No punishment is needed. The elders recognize the truth in a detail they hadn't noticed. Utu doesn't comfort the boy directly. The myth highlights the fact that mercy doesn't need spoken words to work. It just needs truth to be understood. Other stories describe how Utu's presence supported those who were honest, even if they were clumsy, inexperienced, or misunderstood. A young woman accused of disrespecting a noble unintentionally. A traveller blamed for arriving late with important news. A craftsman accused of making a poor offering to a deity. In each case, Utu's guidance doesn't come from divine punishment against the accusers. It comes from small moments of clarity, the sort that reveal details gradually. His mercy works through patience. People believed Utu's mercy was strongest when someone was genuine. If they carried no deceit, his light didn't just reveal the world, it revealed their honesty. This belief encouraged people to be open, cooperative, and careful. They didn't rely on luck when facing accusations. They relied on truth being consistent. That consistency came from Utu's presence, not from human systems. In the myths, even when someone is guilty, Utu doesn't rush to condemn. He observes. He lets the truth settle. He waits until the right moment for clarity to appear. People interpreted this not as leniency, but as fairness. Innocence isn't rushed. Guilt isn't rushed. Everything is illuminated in time. This approach influenced how they viewed punishment. Punishment wasn't the point. Understanding was. If someone made a mistake without malicious intent, Utu's stories often showed mercy arriving through daylight. If someone acted deliberately to cause harm, the truth eventually surfaced, even if it took longer. These myths taught that fairness isn't about catching people. It's about understanding situations fully. Utu's mercy didn't favour people blindly, it favoured accuracy. One powerful myth tells of a woman falsely accused of infidelity. Her community reacts harshly. She protests her innocence, but the situation escalates quickly. The accusation threatens her life. In despair, she prays under the morning sun. When Utu rises, his light happens to reveal footprints leading away from her home in a direction no one had noticed. The real culprit emerges, someone who had entered the home secretly. Her innocence is restored, and the story emphasizes that Utu didn't intervene through dramatic force, he intervened through timing. Truth appeared when the world became visible. This narrative became a touchstone for generations. It taught them that innocence didn't disappear just because people doubted it. It remained, waiting for clarity. Utu provided that clarity, not through confrontation but through illumination. His role in these stories isn't passive, it's gentle. He doesn't shout the truth, he lets the world show it. Kings also appear in myths receiving Utu's mercy in moments of uncertainty. A ruler may act rashly, make a decision based on incomplete information, or misjudge a situation. When this happens, Utu's guidance often helps the king understand his error before consequences grow worse. These stories don't portray kings as infallible. They portray them as people who need clarity just as the humble do. Mercy from Utu doesn't elevate kings. It humbles them. It invites them to acknowledge mistakes without fear of losing legitimacy. A king guided by Utu becomes wiser because he learns from the truth rather than resisting it. Travelers seeking mercy feel Utu's presence through simple signs. A path becomes clearer. Water is found in the direction the sunlight highlights. A dangerous animal moves away as daylight strengthens. These aren't miraculous interventions. They are natural moments made meaningful by the belief that Utu's clarity supports those who travel with honest intent. If a traveller gets lost because of weather or exhaustion, stories describe Utu guiding them by revealing familiar landmarks or patterns. His mercy doesn't guarantee safety, it offers direction. One story describes a wanderer accused of trespassing after entering private farmland by mistake. He explains that he had been lost and didn't mean harm, but no one believes him at first. Utu's light eventually reveals tracks showing he had been walking in circles, exhausted and confused. The community sees the pattern and understands he wasn't trying to steal or deceive. Mercy arrives through understanding, not through divine speech. The myth ends without grand resolution, only the acknowledgement that clarity restored peace. What makes these stories consistent is their gentle tone. Utu doesn't appear with dramatic flair. He doesn't solve problems through force. He isn't a god who intervenes directly in human affairs to impose outcomes. His influence comes from light falling on details people hadn't noticed, from moments when understanding becomes possible, from the slow process of truth aligning with perception. The idea of mercy beneath the sun shaped how people handled disputes. They learned to look carefully. They learned to wait until daylight before making decisions. They learned to give situations time to become clear. This practice reduced unnecessary conflict. It encouraged reflection. It helped prevent harm born of misunderstanding. Utu's mercy wasn't a reward. It was a reminder that fairness takes time. This concept extended into rituals. Some communities waited until sunrise to perform important ceremonies, believing Utu's presence helped prevent mistakes. Others timed confessions or declarations of loyalty with the movement of the sun across the sky. They trusted that honesty carried greater weight when spoken under daylight. They believed Utu's mercy protected sincere people, even if they had made errors. The consistency of the sun's movement became a framework for how people structured fairness in their lives. In the myths, Utu also guides innocents through dreams, offering clarity when they face decisions that might harm them. These dreams aren't symbolic or cryptic. They carry gentle understanding. A dream might show someone a detail they missed the day before. It might remind them of something they forgot. It might simply help them feel calm enough to think clearly. This softer form of guidance reflects the connection between night and day in Utu's story. He travels beneath the world at night, not to terrify spirits, but to understand them. When he returns to the land of the living, he brings that understanding with him. Because of this, Mercy and Utu's stories doesn't separate day from night. It flows through both realms. It reflects the belief that truth isn't limited to one part of the world. It exists everywhere. His journey ensures that nothing remains hidden forever. Innocence might be buried in confusion for a time, but it will rise when daylight returns. That belief kept people hopeful, especially when they couldn't defend themselves effectively in the moment. One of the more complex stories describes a man wrongly blamed for a series of thefts occurring near a temple. Suspicion grows for weeks, and he becomes isolated. The story doesn't portray him as perfect. He is flawed, impatient, and sometimes careless. But he isn't guilty. He prays to Utu not for rescue but for patience, hoping that the truth will come. Eventually the real thief is discovered when sunlight reveals a hiding place he didn't cover well. The myth focuses less on the thief and more on the man's relief. He isn't rewarded dramatically. He is simply understood. This pattern teaches something important about Utu's mercy. It isn't about rewarding good behaviour or punishing bad behaviour. It's about revealing reality. Innocence doesn't need dramatic protection. It needs acknowledgement. And acknowledgement comes when things are visible. People cherish these stories because they reflected how they wanted the world to work. They wanted fairness to be accessible to all, not only those with influence. They wanted clarity to help the vulnerable. They wanted truth to surface even when circumstances seemed hopeless. In a world with limited formal systems of justice, these myths gave them confidence that the world had a natural way of correcting misunderstandings. As these stories continued circulating across generations, people built their sense of morality around the belief that fairness flows naturally from clarity. They believed Utu watched over those who couldn't defend themselves, not through dramatic intervention, but through the simple act of letting truth emerge when sunlight touched the world. His mercy became a part of daily life. It shaped how people spoke, how they judged others, and how they understood justice. And from this foundation of clarity, the next part of Utu's story continues through the places that honoured him most. Temples built not to impress through grandeur, but to anchor the belief that light, fairness, and understanding belong to everyone who lived beneath the steady path of the sun. Long before the first carved laws appeared, before kingdoms expanded across the river valleys, before anyone imagined that cities could rise into places of towering walls and bustling markets, there were quiet moments in the early morning when a handful of devoted people stood waiting for the sky to brighten. They weren't kings, they weren't warriors, they weren't the wealthiest members of their communities. They were the ones who woke before the rest of the city stirred, climbing stone steps still cool from the night, positioning themselves carefully so that their eyes were fixed on the horizon. These were the priests of Utu, and their work wasn't to command or perform great spectacles. Their work was simply to watch, to greet the first light, and to understand it. The temples dedicated to Utu weren't grand in the earliest days. They were small structures made of mud brick, built in places where the view toward the eastern sky was clear. Over time they grew larger, gaining more rooms and courtyards, but even then their purpose remained the same. They were places designed to welcome light. They weren't built for darkness. They weren't made to house secrets. They were built so that when the first warmth of morning touched the world, it touched the temples of Utu first. People didn't come to these temples expecting miracles. They came expecting clarity. They believed the priest could help them understand what Utu revealed. The priest didn't promise power or wealth. They offered understanding. Their temple rituals weren't focused on dramatic gestures. They focused on the slow arrival of the sun, the quiet recognition of truth emerging from shadow. Everything they did followed the rhythm of Utu's daily journey. In cities like Sippar and Lhasa, the temples of Utu eventually became some of the most respected places in Mesopotamia. These cities weren't known primarily for military strength or vast empires. They were known for their connection to fairness. People believed that living near Utu's temple meant that clarity would be part of their lives. The priests reinforced this belief by watching the sun as if it were delivering the world's daily reminder that understanding was possible. Their duty wasn't complex, it was repetitive, but repetition carried meaning. When dawn approached, the priests would gather on the temple roof. They stood silently, facing the east. Some held simple instruments for timekeeping. Others simply watched. The first sliver of light always appeared slowly, and the priesthood treated it with a patience that influenced anyone who came to them for guidance. They waited for the moment when the sun fully emerged, when Utu was believed to step onto his daily path. This wasn't a moment of dramatic celebration. It was a moment of recognition. They believed the sun revealed not just the world, but the moral framework beneath it. The structure of these temples reflected this belief. They were built with wide entrances facing the horizon. Their courtyards were positioned so they received sunlight throughout the day. Their walls often held images of Utu emerging between two mountains, holding the symbols of clarity and judgment. These symbols weren't decorative. They reminded people that the temple existed to support fairness, not power. Priests of Utu didn't claim authority over others. They claimed responsibility for observing, understanding, and guiding. The daily practices inside these temples followed the same slow rhythm. There were prayers offered softly at sunrise, not with urgency but with appreciation. There were readings of omens based on how the sunlight fell on particular objects or how shadows stretched across the floor. The priests weren't predicting the future. They were helping people interpret the present. When someone came seeking advice, the priest often encouraged them to return the next morning and watch the sunrise with them. This wasn't done to delay answers. It was done because clarity often appeared when people allowed themselves to slow down. These temples were also places where records were kept. Scribal rooms stored clay tablets containing legal documents, agreements, and histories. Utu's association with truth made his temples natural archives. If a contract needed safeguarding, people trusted it to Utu's temple. If a boundary dispute required documentation, the temple was where it was stored. The priests didn't enforce the documents, they maintained them. They believed the act of keeping records was part of preserving clarity. Just as sunlight revealed truth, writing preserved it. People often visited the temples of Utu not because they faced dramatic crises, but because they wanted reassurance. A farmer worried about the coming season, a trader uncertain about a business agreement, a young couple considering marriage. The priests didn't give direct commands, they offered perspective. They encouraged people to consider their decisions in the light of the new day. In a world where life could be unpredictable, these conversations mattered. One story describes a man who visited the temple every morning for 2 weeks, troubled by a decision he needed to make about his land. The priest didn't tell him what to do. Instead, he invited him to sit and watch the sunrise each day. By the end of the 2 weeks, the man understood his own decision. Nothing dramatic happened. No divine voice spoke. No sign appeared in the sky. The clarity arrived because he had given himself time to think. The temple simply provided a space where he could do that. This slow method of helping people showed why Utu's priests were respected. They didn't claim secret knowledge. They didn't work through intimidation. They worked through patience. Their understanding of the world came not from visions but from observation. They watched the movement of light the same way others watched the movement of water or the growth of plants. Stillness didn't bore them. Stillness revealed things. The temples weren't only for people seeking guidance. They were also places where laws were read aloud to ensure everyone heard them clearly. This wasn't a political performance. It was an extension of Utu's role as guardian of fairness. Laws needed to be spoken in sunlight, not whispered in the dark. People gathered in temple courtyards to hear decisions, announcements, or clarifications of rules. Standing under the sun connected the idea of law to the idea of truth, making the experience feel anchored in something beyond human authority. Priests also maintained the sacred spaces inside the temples. These weren't filled with dramatic statues or ornate decorations. They were simple, open, and practical. The inner rooms often contained a raised platform with symbols of Utu carved into stone or clay. These symbols didn't depict violent power or overwhelming force. They depicted Utu holding tools associated with fairness, a saw-like instrument for cutting through falsehood, a stylized disc representing the sun's clarity. The meaning behind these images was straightforward. Justice wasn't about dominance, it was about precision and visibility. In some cities, the temples contained water basins placed in view of the morning sun. The priests used the reflections to track seasonal changes, not for mystical reasons, but for agricultural planning. The connection between Utu and practical knowledge made the temples valuable centres of community life. People visited not only for guidance, but for information. They trusted the priest to understand what the land and sky were showing them. Stories also describe how the temple priests served as mediators in disputes. Their authority didn't come from fear, it came from their association with clarity. When two parties disagreed, the priests encouraged both to speak honestly in a setting where Utu's light fell on them. The sunlight served as a quiet reminder that truth mattered. This approach didn't solve every problem, but it often calmed tempers. A dispute discussed in darkness felt heavier. A dispute discussed in daylight felt less threatening. The priests weren't commanding solutions. They were creating conditions where solutions could emerge. The stories of these temples frequently mention mornings. The priests believed morning was when understanding flowed most easily. The world hadn't yet accumulated the noise and complexity of the day. The quiet at dawn mirrored the quiet needed to think clearly. Many people approached Utu's temples at this hour, not because they needed ritual, but because they needed space to breathe. They came to watch the eastern glow and remind themselves that clarity returns even after difficult nights. One account describes a young woman struggling with grief after losing a family member. She visited the temple each morning, sitting in silence as the sun rose. The priest didn't lecture her or offer philosophical explanations. They simply sat nearby, letting her have as much space as she needed. Over time, she began speaking with them, not seeking answers to unanswerable questions, but sharing her thoughts. The priests responded with gentle reminders that time brings clarity. They didn't promise healing. They promised understanding. The temple became a place where her grief could soften rather than overwhelm her. Another story tells of a merchant who suffered a series of failures. He believed he'd lost his ability to make wise decisions. He visited the temple at dawn to ask for guidance. The priests asked him to reflect on which choices he had made quickly and which he had made with patience. In the morning light, he realized he'd been rushing. The temple didn't grant him success. It gave him perspective. His confidence returned not because Utu intervened directly, but because he remembered how to think clearly. These stories show how deeply the temples were woven into the lives of ordinary people. They weren't remote places reserved for the elite. They were community anchors. Children played in their courtyards. Elders gathered to talk. Travellers stopped to rest before continuing their journey. The temples felt open because they were literally open. Sunlight entered them freely. No dark corners held secrets. Everything was visible. This transparency reflected Utu's values. As cities expanded and temples grew more elaborate, the priests continued their same steady routine. They didn't adopt the dramatic styles of other religious orders. They didn't amplify their rituals. Their quietness remained part of who they were. They understood that the significance of Utu came not from spectacle but from consistency. They believed the world operated best when clarity guided it, and their temples served as reminders of that belief. Some temples held festivals where people celebrated the stability and fairness Utu brought. These gatherings weren't wild or extravagant. They involved gentle music, simple offerings, and recitations of stories that reminded people of Utu's role in their lives. These stories weren't meant to inspire awe. They were meant to reassure. They emphasized how Utu supported fairness, how he protected the innocent, how he illuminated truth. These festivals reinforced the idea that clarity was something to be valued. One festival involved creating small clay tokens shaped like suns. Children often helped shape them, pressing their fingers into the soft clay before the tokens were baked in the sun. These tokens weren't talismans, they were reminders. People kept them in their homes to remember that clarity existed even in difficult times. The temples encouraged this simple practice because it helped people stay grounded. Priests also played a role in advising rulers. Kings visited the temples to seek counsel before making major decisions. But the advice they received didn't come in the form of divine commands. It came in the form of questions. The priests asked the kings to consider how their decisions affected others, whether they aligned with fairness, whether they reflected clarity rather than confusion. Kings often left the temples not with answers but with better understanding of their responsibilities. This relationship between the priesthood and the leadership of the cities reflected how deeply Utu's values shaped society. Fairness wasn't just something people desired, it was something they practiced. Clarity wasn't just a spiritual ideal, it was a practical necessity. And the temples, with their wide entrances and sunlit courtyards, embodied those principles. Travellers from distant lands sometimes sought out these temples out of curiosity. They heard stories about the priests who watched the sunrise and wanted to understand what made these places different. They found a simple environment where people moved slowly, spoke gently, and focused on understanding rather than ceremony. Many visitors described feeling calmer after leaving the temple, even if they didn't fully understand Utu's mythology. The atmosphere itself invited reflection. No matter how many centuries passed, the temples remained tied to the same central idea. Light reveals what needs to be seen. The priests didn't try to explain everything. They didn't try to interpret every sign. They acknowledged that truth revealed itself gradually, the way dawn unfolded. Their work was to observe, maintain the temple, support the community, and honour Utu by honouring clarity. The more closely you look at the stories about these temples, the more you notice how grounded they are. They don't describe supernatural spectacles or magical events. They describe people watching the world carefully. They describe decisions made with patience. They describe fairness growing from visibility. They describe mercy arriving through understanding. The temples didn't claim to control these forces. They claimed to reflect them. Standing on the temple roof at dawn, the priests watched the moment when night became day. They didn't rush it. They didn't impose meaning on it. They let it unfold. That simple act shaped the entire culture surrounding Utu. The temples weren't places of mystery. They were places of openness. People visited because they wanted to feel part of that openness. They wanted to be reminded that clarity doesn't belong only to the powerful. It belongs to anyone who stands in the light and seeks understanding. And as Utu's light continued shaping both the temples and the people who visited them, the cities themselves began to change, adopting principles of fairness that aligned with the God who walked across the sky each day. This connection shaped not only the religious life of the region, but also the political and social structure of the lands that grew under his steady, revealing gaze. When the first cities began rising along the wide, wandering rivers of Mesopotamia, people didn't think of themselves as building something grand. They were simply gathering near places that made life easier. The Euphrates and Tigris didn't just offer water, they offered patterns, floods that returned each year, fields that grew green after the waters retreated, soil that accepted seeds readily and gave back grain if cared for. In a world that could be unpredictable in many ways, the rivers carried a kind of consistency. And consistent things felt trustworthy. Consistency helped people breathe easier. That same feeling is what made Utu's presence so central to the life of these early cities. Just as the rivers shaped the land, his light shaped the way people lived together. As settlements grew into towns and towns grew into cities, the need for fairness expanded alongside the population. People worked closer together, they traded more often, they shared boundaries, tasks and tools. They had to rely on one another in ways that weren't necessary in small villages. This closeness made life richer, but it also created more opportunities for disagreement. Water rights, land ownership, trade agreements, debt, inheritance. These weren't small concerns. They affected families and futures. And so, as society became more complex, the principles associated with Utu became more important. Utu's law wasn't a set of written rules in the earliest days. It was a sense of how the world should work. His law lived in daylight. It lived in the belief that clarity makes fairness possible. The cities that honoured him didn't enforce his principles through fear. They enforced them through habit, through expectation, through the shared understanding that life worked better when the truth wasn't hidden. That way of thinking shaped everything from city planning to trade. In cities like Sippar, Lhasa and people built marketplaces in open areas where sunlight fell easily. They favoured wide courtyards over narrow alleys. They held important meetings in places where daylight reached every corner. They believed that if Utu's light didn't touch a space, it wasn't a place where serious decisions should be made. This approach created an environment where transparency wasn't symbolic, it was literal. People lived in open structures, worked in fields exposed to the sky, and handled disputes in clear view of others. This openness wasn't just aesthetic, it had practical benefits. In a world without advanced tools or extensive technology, visibility allowed problems to be identified quickly. A damaged canal wall could be spotted early. A child lost among the stalls of a busy market could be found more easily. A dishonest trader had fewer places to hide faulty goods. The layout of the city itself encouraged honesty. People didn't need to rely solely on formal judgment. They relied on Utu's simple principle. If everyone can see clearly, fairness follows more naturally. The law that developed in these places reflected this mindset. Early legal codes weren't created to restrict people. They were created to provide structure where complexity had grown too large to manage informally. These laws took inspiration from Utu's relationship with the world. They emphasized restitution over punishment. They focused on restoring balance, not asserting dominance. When someone damaged property, the goal was to repair the damage, not ruin the offender. When someone broke a promise, the goal was to clarify the misunderstanding, not escalate conflict. This approach mirrored Utu's method of addressing issues through illumination rather than force. Families learned to record agreements in writing not because they mistrusted each other, but because they understood that memory could falter. Writing preserved clarity. Utu's influence shaped the mindset behind these practices. A written agreement wasn't a weapon. It was a tool to help truth remain visible over time. The same logic guided the establishment of courts. Judges weren't meant to be feared. They were meant to help people understand situations when they became too complicated for casual resolution. The judge served as a representative of Utu, not through power, but through clarity. As cities grew more crowded, the priesthood of Utu played a larger role in maintaining fairness. Their temples collected records of contracts, land divisions, and disputes that had been resolved. These records weren't locked away, they were available for review. People trusted the temple because it was a place designed to honour clarity. It wasn't a political entity. It wasn't influenced by wealth. It simply reflected the values Utu represented. Priests didn't decide outcomes alone. They helped people see details more clearly, encouraging honesty and understanding. One of the clearest examples of Utu's influence on city life can be seen in how they managed water. Water was the most important resource. Fields needed irrigation channels. Canals needed maintenance. Cities needed to prevent floods while ensuring that crops received what they needed. Arguments about water could escalate quickly because water meant survival. In most cultures, whoever controlled water controlled the people. But in the cities honouring Utu, water management was a shared responsibility. They held meetings at dawn to discuss canal repairs. They assigned tasks openly. The assumption was that fairness grew when everyone could participate in decision-making under visible conditions. This collaborative approach made conflicts less frequent. When a canal needed repair, people worked together because the priesthood reminded them that clarity didn't serve private interests. It served the whole community. If someone broke a canal wall purposely, sunlight made the wrongdoing visible. There wasn't much room for deception. This environment helped reduce mistrust. The cities flourished because fairness wasn't an idea imposed on people. It was a natural extension of how they understood the world. Trade also reflected Utu's principles. Markets operated during daylight hours. Traders displayed their goods openly. Transactions were conducted in public spaces. This transparency made cheating difficult. It also encouraged cooperation. Buyers didn't need to inspect goods in shadows or rely on verbal guarantees alone. They could see the quality for themselves. This built a kind of economic trust that strengthened the city's stability. When disputes did arise, they were settled in the same open areas, with the same expectation that clarity would resolve confusion. The influence of Utu stretched into family life as well. The laws recorded in the cities often emphasized fairness in inheritance, marriage, and property. These rules reflected the idea that families should be treated with balance. When someone passed away, their belongings weren't seized by the state. They were divided carefully, based on established customs. When marriages formed, agreements were recorded to protect both parties. These practices weren't driven by emotion. They were driven by clarity, ensuring that expectations were clear before conflicts could arise. The earliest legal tablets often show how careful these cities were about maintaining fairness. They described consequences for dishonesty, but they also described protections for the innocent. They explained how witnesses should be used, how evidence should be gathered, and how judges should evaluate claims. The logic behind these rules wasn't theoretical. It was influenced by centuries of watching how light brought understanding. If daylight revealed truth, then legal procedures should mimic that process. Slow, clear, open. Many citizens believed that Utu walked through their city spiritually each day, even though physically he moved across the sky. His judgment didn't belong to temples alone. It belonged everywhere his light touched. This belief encouraged people to reflect on their behaviour. They weren't frightened by the idea of Utu watching them. They were reassured by it. His presence was a reminder of fairness, not punishment. If someone treated others unfairly, they knew Utu's light would eventually reveal the consequences. This wasn't a threat. It was a natural expectation. Stories passed down through families describe moments when Utu's presence shaped decisions. One story tells of a family arguing over land boundaries. They visited a local judge who suggested they walk the perimeter together at dawn. As they did, Utu's light revealed the edge of an older boundary stone partially buried in the earth. The dispute ended peacefully. This wasn't portrayed as miraculous. It was portrayed as ordinary, exactly how clarity works when people take the time to look. Another story describes a trader accused of manipulating weights. The judge asked that the accusation be examined during the morning marketplace. Under sunlight, the trader's faulty weights became obvious. He apologized, corrected his ways, and continued trading. His reputation recovered not because punishment was severe, but because the truth had been acknowledged openly. The community valued honesty more than perfection. Utu's light made this possible. In the cities that honoured Utu, fairness didn't feel like an ideal. It felt like part of daily life. People understood that misunderstandings happened. They understood that mistakes occurred. They didn't expect perfection. They expected clarity. They believed that as long as people acted with sincerity, Utu's light would support them, helping truth emerge even when confusion clouded it initially. These beliefs shaped a culture where trust could flourish. The architecture of these cities also reflected Utu's influence. Houses were often built around open courtyards that allowed sunlight to enter. Public buildings faced the east. Important roads were aligned with the rising and setting sun. These choices weren't symbolic, they were practical. Light helped people work, travel, and make decisions. The presence of sunlight inside homes created a sense of openness. It reduced the mystery that often surrounded complicated matters in other cultures. Hidden rooms or dark passages were rare. People preferred spaces where everyone could see each other clearly. As time passed, cities became increasingly sophisticated, with structured governments, organised markets, and extensive systems of record-keeping. But Utu's influence didn't diminish. If anything, it grew stronger. Kings invoked his name when issuing laws. Judges referenced him when explaining their decisions. Ordinary people spoke of him when teaching children about honesty. His presence gave the cities a sense of stability that political power alone couldn't provide. Later dynasties built larger temples to honour him. These structures served as centres for legal authority. Judges consulted with priests before making major decisions, not because priests held power, but because they represented the values associated with Utu. Kings sometimes visited the temples publicly to demonstrate their commitment to fairness. These appearances weren't meant to intimidate. They were meant to reassure the population that leadership aligned with clarity rather than force. One of the strongest examples of this connection appears in the Code of Hammurabi. Although Hammurabi ruled centuries after the earlier cities of Sumer, he framed his laws as being approved by Shamash, the Akkadian name for Utu. In monuments depicting the king receiving symbols of authority, Shamash sits or stands before him as the figure guiding the law. This imagery wasn't decorative. It showed that even the most powerful kings wanted to be associated with Utu's fairness. They understood that their legitimacy depended not only on might but on clarity. People living in these cities felt safer because of this alignment between spiritual belief and legal structure. They knew their leaders valued fairness. They knew that if a dispute arose, there were procedures that reflected Utu's principles. They knew that truth couldn't easily be hidden. This sense of security allowed the cities to grow, encouraging trade, craftsmanship, and cultural exchange. Fairness was not only a moral benefit, it was an economic advantage. People were more willing to travel, trade, and invest when they believed their efforts wouldn't be undermined by corruption or secrecy. Children grew up learning these values naturally. They watched their parents discuss matters openly in courtyards. They listened to judges speak in public spaces. They accompanied their families to temples during festivals that honoured Utu's consistency. They absorbed the message that truth emerges in the open, that fairness comes from taking the time to see things as they are, that hiding or rushing makes decisions weaker. These lessons shape the next generation of citizens, ensuring that Utu's influence remained strong even as cities expanded and cultures evolved. Travellers who visited these cities often wrote about the atmosphere of order they found. They described marketplaces that felt balanced, courts that felt fair, and communities that seemed calmer than those in other regions. They attributed this to the influence of the sun god, noting that his temples were among the first buildings visible when approaching the city. These observations weren't exaggerated. The cities themselves were structured in ways that encouraged trust. Utu's presence wasn't symbolic. It was part of the foundation. What stands out most when reading about these cities is how naturally fairness flowed through them. There was no rigid division between religious life, political life, and daily life. Everything was influenced by the belief that clarity makes the world better. This belief didn't require people to be perfect. It required them to try. It required them to approach decisions thoughtfully. It required them to be honest enough to let the truth guide them. Utu's law wasn't enforced through fear. It was reinforced through habit. People learned to pause before acting impulsively. They learned to wait until daylight revealed missing details. They learned to ask for help when they didn't understand something. These practices became part of the city's rhythm. Even visitors sensed it. As the cities continued to grow, the connection between Utu's light and social order remained strong. The land of rivers was not always peaceful. It faced invasions, droughts, internal disputes, and political shifts. But even during difficult times, the belief in fairness persisted. The memory of Utu walking across the sky each day reminded people that stability came from clarity, not from force. When confusion threatened to pull communities apart, they returned to the principles they knew. Look carefully, seek understanding, act with honesty. And as these principles held the cities together, they shaped not only the daily life of the people, but the stories they told. These stories continued to remind them that fairness wasn't a fragile concept. It was a part of the world's natural order, illuminated every morning when Utu stepped once again across the horizon to begin his steady, patient journey across the sky. Long after the earlier settlements along the rivers built their first modest temples to Utu, the world around them began to expand in ways they couldn't have imagined. Cities rose where marshes once held the morning mist. Trade routes stretched over plains and mountains. Empires formed, fractured, and formed again. With each shift, people carried stories with them. They carried beliefs, symbols, and memories of the gods who shaped their understanding of the world. Of all the deities that travelled with the movement of cultures, few moved as gently yet steadily as the god of the rising sun. In time, Utu became known by another name, Shamash, and his influence reached far beyond the boundaries of Sumer. When Sumerian culture blended into the Akkadian world, many gods shifted identities or merged with new interpretations. But the sun didn't lose itself in this process. It simply gained a broader presence. Akkadian communities lived alongside Sumerians, sharing markets, work, and rituals. They spoke different languages, but they lived under the same sky. The sun rose for all of them, and its consistency tied their worlds together. When they adopted Utu, they didn't change his nature. They simply gave him a new name that fit their language. Shamash felt familiar because he carried the same clarity, fairness, and steady presence that Utu had always represented. In these early centuries of cultural blending, Shamash didn't become a figure of conquest or dominance. He became a point of connection. Different groups recognized the same qualities in him because they experienced the same world. Morning light touched their cities in the same way. Shadows stretched across their courtyards with the same quiet effect. A god of judgment and truth made sense in every community where disagreements had to be resolved and daily life depended on cooperation. Shamash became the shared guardian of fairness in a world that was becoming more interconnected. As empires formed, Shamash gained official recognition in royal inscriptions, monumental carvings, and legal declarations. Kings invoked him not only as a god of daylight, but as a god of justice, emphasizing his role in maintaining order. One of the most famous examples is found on the stele of the Code of Hammurabi, where a carved image shows the king receiving symbols of authority directly from Shamash. This image wasn't a casual artistic choice. It represented a belief that even the most powerful rulers required legitimacy rooted in fairness. Shamash provided that. His presence signalled that laws were grounded in truth rather than fear. The adoption of Shamash in Akkadian and Babylonian culture didn't change his core identity. Instead, it expanded it. The myth surrounding him gained details, but the foundation remained the same. He was still the one who illuminated the world. He was still the one who watched over the innocent. He was still the one who guided heroes and rulers. His light still revealed the truth, and his judgment still encouraged balance. As Shamash's influence spread, his temples grew more elaborate. Cities that had been small outposts became major centres of worship. Lhasa and Sippar became especially important, serving as homes to large temples where priests continued the old tradition of watching the sunrise. They didn't abandon the practices of their Sumerian ancestors, they preserved them. Every morning, priests still climbed to the rooftops facing the eastern horizon. They greeted the glow with the same calm attention, trusting that clarity would continue shaping their community. The stories of Shamash continued evolving as they travelled across different regions. In the north, where Assyrian culture intertwined with the older traditions of Sumer and Akkad, Shamash became a symbol of reliable strength. Assyrian kings included him in their inscriptions as a witness to their actions. They believed that if they ruled unjustly, Shamash would see it. Even in a culture known for military power, the sun god represented restraint, balance, and the steady flow of just decisions. Kings often justified their actions by stating they acted in accordance with Shamash's will. This wasn't a claim of divine tyranny, it was a claim of alignment with fairness. Shamash also played a role in the daily life of these northern regions. People invoked him when settling disputes. Merchants prayed to him before long journeys. Families sought his blessing for clarity in hard times. His influence wasn't limited to temples or royal inscriptions. It lived in simple gestures, in the way people look towards sunrise when making important choices. As trade routes expanded across Mesopotamia, Shamash's presence travelled with merchants, sailors and caravans. He became known not only in the major cities but in remote settlements, oases and outposts. Travellers carried small tokens shaped like suns or marked with symbols representing his light. They believed these reminders helped keep their minds clear. When they faced uncertainty, they held these small objects to steady themselves. Shamash wasn't believed to protect travellers through force. He was believed to help them see their surroundings more clearly, allowing them to avoid danger or misunderstanding. The spread of Shamash wasn't confined to the Mesopotamian heartland. As cultures interacted through trade, migration and diplomacy, stories about him reached the Levant, Anatolia and beyond. In many cases, people didn't adopt him as a new deity. Instead, they recognized elements of his nature in their own gods. Light, justice and truth were universal concerns. Many cultures mirrored these values in their deities. Shamash became a reference point, a figure people could speak of when discussing the moral order of the world. In the Levantine regions, where city-states such as Mari interacted frequently with Babylonian rulers, Shamash became part of diplomatic language. Letters between kings often invoked him when discussing treaties. These invocations weren't ornamental, they signalled sincerity. A promise made under the light of Shamash carried weight. Even if a king didn't worship him in the same way as a Babylonian ruler, he respected his association with truth. This cross-cultural understanding helped maintain fragile alliances. Anatolian cultures, including the Hittites, referenced solar deities with roles similar to Shamash, emphasizing order and truth. While their gods had different names and stories, they shared the conviction that daylight revealed what needed to be seen. When Babylonian scribes and Hittite scribes communicated, they often treated Shamash and the Hittite solar gods as equivalent figures. This equivalence helped bridge cultural differences, making it easier for civilizations to negotiate peace, trade, and cooperation. Even in distant regions of the Near East, Shamash's imagery appeared in seals, amulets, and administrative objects. These items travelled along trade routes stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. They carried with them symbols that outlived their original context. Some merchants who used these items might not have known all of Shamash's stories, but they knew the symbol meant clarity. They knew it meant fairness. They knew it meant a promise kept in sunlight rather than hidden in shadow. The spread of Shamash wasn't merely geographic, it was conceptual. His principles travelled in the structure of laws adopted by different regions. When rulers crafted legal codes, they often invoked solar gods as their source of legitimacy. The logic behind these laws echoed the traditions of Shamash. They emphasized restitution, responsible conduct, and honesty. They required that disputes be heard with patience. They made room for careful investigation. These elements stemmed from centuries of relying on Utu and Shamash as symbols of clarity. Babylonian scribes played a significant role in spreading these ideas. Their writings influenced regions far beyond their homeland. When they copied texts describing Shamash's qualities, these manuscripts travelled to distant libraries. They ended up in palaces, temples, and administrative centres. Scribes in other cultures read them, learned from them, and incorporated similar ideas into their own traditions. In this way, Shamash's influence shaped the intellectual life of the ancient world. In stories, Shamash continued to guide heroes well beyond the Sumerian era. Gilgamesh and Enkidu appealed to him during their epic journey, and later retellings carried that tradition forward. When scholars in later centuries read these stories, they encountered Shamash not as a relic of the past, but as a living figure whose presence shaped moral decisions. They saw him as the one who listened to prayers for justice, who supported sincere efforts to understand difficult situations, and who illuminated paths that might otherwise be lost in confusion. Shamash's presence even affected the design of legal rooms and public spaces in Babylon and other regions influenced by Mesopotamian culture. Courtrooms were built with openings that allowed sunlight to enter. Some had windows placed specifically to catch the first light of dawn. This wasn't symbolic decoration. It was a practical and spiritual expression of an idea. Fairness requires visibility. Judges weren't hidden away. They worked in open spaces where the light reminded them of their responsibility to clarity. In later centuries, as new empires formed, the memory of Shamash continued to guide people. Even when they no longer spoke Sumerian or Akkadian, the belief in a sun-linked principle of fairness persisted. Some cultures replaced the name Shamash with new names, blending his qualities with their local traditions. Others absorbed his attributes into broader concepts of cosmic order. In each case, the essence remained. The sun still represented the idea that truth cannot hide forever. When the Persian Empire rose, Zoroastrian ideas gained influence. Although different in structure and theology, Zoroastrian beliefs emphasized truth, righteousness, and the fight against deception. The sun, as a symbol of clarity, played a role in their worldview. While Shamash wasn't worshipped in the same form, echoes of his values lingered. The idea that light exposes wrongdoing, that fairness aligns with cosmic order, and that justice requires seeing things clearly continued shaping the region's moral outlook. Greek travellers who visited the Near East wrote about Babylonian practices and observed how deeply the sun was tied to ideas of law. They connected Shamash to their own solar figures, though the relationships were more interpretive than direct. Even so, the Greeks respected the Mesopotamian tradition of linking judgment with daylight. Their philosophers adopted variations of these ideas, arguing that clear thought mirrors the clarity of sunlight. Later Roman writers mentioned Shamash indirectly through their descriptions of Eastern religious practices. They didn't necessarily adopt him, but they acknowledged the consistency of his role in maintaining order. His presence in ancient literature became part of the foundation later historians used to understand the moral systems of the region. As centuries passed and new religions emerged, the memory of Shamash remained embedded in the cultural fabric of the Near East. Even when his temples fell silent, the values he represented continued shaping daily life. People still held trials during the day. Communities still valued honest trade. Rulers still claimed alignment with the principles of fairness. The sun continued to symbolize truth, whether or not Shamash's name was spoken. In some ways, Shamash's spread across civilizations wasn't about religious dominance. It was about the consistent presence of the sun itself. People everywhere woke to daylight. They saw how it revealed details. They understood how it supported life. They connected these experiences to the idea of fairness. When cultures learned from each other, the sun became a shared reference point, linking them even when their languages, customs, and histories differed. Shamash was part of that link. Archaeologists uncovering artifacts of the ancient world frequently encounter symbols associated with Shamash. Rays carved into stone, sun discs pressed into clay tablets, seals showing a figure emerging between mountains. These images appear in places far beyond the earlier Sumerian temples. They appear in regions influenced by the Babylonian Empire. They appear in trade hubs connecting cultures. They appear in administrative centres that adopted Mesopotamian legal traditions. Each symbol represents not only a deity but a mindset. It represents a belief in clarity. Even after the last temples to Shamash faded, the stories continued circulating in manuscripts, oral traditions, and cultural memory. In time, modern scholars rediscovered these myths and recognized the continuity they carried. They realized that Shamash wasn't simply a Sumerian or Babylonian god. He was a reflection of how early civilizations understood fairness. He showed that justice wasn't something invented in one era or shaped by one culture. It was a shared need, expressed through the steady presence of sunlight. Today, when people read these ancient myths, they often see Shamash as a symbol rather than a deity they worship. They see him as a reminder that fairness depends on visibility, that understanding grows through patience, and that truth requires openness. These ideas still resonate because they reflect basic human experience. People still feel calmer in sunlight. They still seek clarity when making decisions. They still associate brightness with understanding and darkness with uncertainty. Shamash's spread across civilization shows how a simple idea, light reveals truth, can shape societies for thousands of years. His presence didn't fade as cultures changed. It continued beneath new names and new systems, finding its way into legal structures, ethical beliefs, and daily habits. Every time people gathered outdoors to resolve disputes, every time laws were read in public spaces, every time sunrise symbolized a new beginning, the memory of Shamash lived on. And as these ideas continued weaving through the ancient world, they prepared the way for new interpretations of light, truth, and justice that would define the next phases of history, carrying the essence of the sun, God's influence far beyond the river valleys where his story first began. As the centuries drifted far beyond the lifetimes of the first temple priests and the early city scribes, a new kind of curiosity settled over the lands once ruled by the rhythms of Utu. Long after the old myths faded from daily life, long after the temples had been weathered down by sun and wind, people began looking back at these stories with a different purpose. They were no longer asking for guidance or hoping that dawn would bring clarity to their personal struggles. They were trying to understand how societies first learned to live with rules. They were trying to untangle the origins of fairness. They were searching for the earliest figure who shaped the idea of law. And as they sifted through ruins, tablets, and fragments of memory, they found themselves circling back again and again to the same presence in the ancient world. They found themselves returning to the one whose daily journey across the sky had once shaped how people understood truth. They returned to Utu. They returned to Shamash. The task of understanding ancient origins is rarely straightforward. The earliest records are often incomplete. Clay breaks, ink smears, languages disappear. But even with these challenges, certain patterns remain strong enough to draw attention for millennia. The belief that Utu shaped early ideas of fairness became one of those patterns. Scholars studying the first cities recognized the importance of his presence. They saw how stories, laws, and rituals revolved around him. They recognized that he represented something deeper than religious devotion. He represented the principle that justice should not be hidden. As historians, linguists, and archaeologists collected and translated ancient tablets, they noticed something striking. Whenever early laws were introduced, Utu or Shamash was present in the text or imagery. His name appeared in oaths, legal codes, and administrative records. His symbols appeared on seals belonging to judges. His imagery appeared in places where fairness mattered most. The more scholars examined, the more they realized that this connection wasn't a coincidence. The ancient world had relied on Utu because he symbolized clarity in a time when clarity wasn't easy to secure. Some scholars argued that Utu wasn't just a spiritual figure. They believed he served as a conceptual model for what law needed to be. His steady movement across the sky reflected the consistency that legal decisions required. His role as a witness reflected the need for transparency. His connection to daylight reflected the belief that important decisions should be made openly. These scholars suggested that Utu wasn't merely a myth, he was the embodiment of early legal thought. Other scholars approached the topic differently. Instead of seeing Utu as an early lawgiver, they viewed him as a symbolic tool societies used to anchor their systems of justice. They argued that the people of Sumer needed a figure who represented impartiality. In a world without modern institutions, they needed something beyond human authority to remind them that fairness mattered. They made Utu that figure. He became the moral foundation for decisions that might otherwise rely too heavily on personal bias or uncertainty. These scholars believed that the myth of Utu reflected the human desire for stability. When early communities faced disputes, they needed a way to resolve them without resorting to violence or endless argument. By invoking Utu, they invoked the principle that truth should prevail. His involvement in legal matters didn't mean he wrote laws. It meant he provided a framework for thinking about them. His presence in the myths made fairness feel natural. Skeptics saw things differently. They pointed out that gods associated with the sun exist in nearly every culture. They noted that solar deities often became symbols of justice because sunlight naturally reveals what hides in darkness. To them, the connection between Utu and law wasn't surprising. It was a natural outcome of human observation. They argued that people looked to the sun for guidance because it represented the most visible and reliable force in their world. Utu's association with fairness didn't require divine influence. It required attention to the environment. These skeptics didn't dismiss the significance of Utu entirely. They simply believed that the connection between him and early law was rooted in practical thinking rather than divine inspiration. They suggested that early societies needed structure, and they used the most consistent natural element, the sun, as a model. From this perspective, Utu wasn't the first lawgiver. He was the symbol that helped people imagine what law could become. There were also scholars who took a more cautious approach. They didn't dismiss Utu's influence, nor did they treat him as the origin of legal thought. Instead, they examined how his presence affected specific practices. They looked at how legal trials were conducted outdoors. They studied how judges invoked his name when making decisions. They observed how laws emphasized restitution and clarity rather than punishment. They concluded that Utu had a real impact, but not in a direct or literal way. His influence was woven into the daily actions of people who believed fairness was possible. These scholars emphasized that ancient law developed slowly. It didn't appear in one moment, created by one person or one deity. It formed through generations of trial and error. People made decisions based on what felt right. They learned from mistakes. They observed what helped communities stay stable. Utu's presence didn't dictate these developments, but it supported them. He became a steady reference point that helped guide decisions. Another layer of scholarly interest focused on how stories about Utu influenced future generations. When scribes copied stories onto clay tablets, they preserved not only myths but the values contained within them. These scribes played a crucial role in shaping how later societies viewed fairness. They didn't treat Utu as a distant figure. They described him as someone involved in the most important moments of human life. This portrayal gave weight to his connection with law. Some scholars argued that scribes intentionally emphasized Utu's role in legal matters to reinforce their own authority. Scribes were often responsible for recording judgments, contracts, and agreements. By linking their work to the sun god, they gave their tasks a sacred dimension. They presented themselves as guardians of clarity. This argument suggests that the connection between Utu and law might have been strengthened by practical needs within the administration. Yet even if scribes used Utu to reinforce their roles, they did so because people already believed in his clarity. They didn't create the association, they deepened it. They used language and imagery to make the connection stronger, ensuring it became part of the cultural landscape across generations. Their work preserved Utu's presence as a figure who shaped society through understanding. Modern researchers continued examining the long-term effects of this tradition. They compared Mesopotamian legal practices with those of later civilizations. They noticed similarities in how societies structured courts, handled evidence, and resolved disputes. They found echoes of Utu in places far from the ancient cities where he was once worshipped. They traced the spread of legal thinking from Sumer to Akkad, from Babylon to the wider Near East, and from those regions into the frameworks adopted by later cultures. Some believed that Utu's influence indirectly shaped many legal traditions over time. Others argued that similarities arose independently in different cultures. But regardless of the explanation, the fact remained. Early Mesopotamian ideas about fairness left a deep imprint on the ancient world. Utu's presence, whether symbolic or spiritual, had played a role in shaping those ideas. One of the most debated topics among scholars focused on whether Utu should be considered the first lawgiver or whether he was simply the first figure associated with legal thought. Those who supported the idea of Utu as the earliest lawgiver argued that legal traditions began with belief. Before people wrote laws, they believed in fairness as a concept. Utu represented that concept. He was the presence that reminded people that decisions should be guided by understanding. In this view, Utu wasn't just a myth, he was a catalyst. Skeptics pushed back, noting that written legal codes emerged long after the myths of Utu had stabilized. They argued that legal systems developed because cities grew more complex and required formal structure. While Utu played a symbolic role, they believed the true origins of law were rooted in practical governance. They pointed to the earliest administrative tablets, which focused on distribution, taxation, and resource management rather than moral judgment. But even skeptics acknowledged that symbols matter. People organizing a society often look for shared points of meaning. Utu provided that. His association with truth gave legitimacy to leaders and judges. His connection to light gave structure to rituals and procedures. His presence in stories provided examples of fairness that shaped expectations. Whether or not he directly created laws, he shaped the environment that allowed them to develop. Some researchers approached the question from a linguistic angle. They studied the earliest Sumerian words for justice, truth, and judgment. They traced their roots back to descriptive terms related to light, openness, and clarity. They found that the language itself reflected the idea that fairness was tied to visibility. This linguistic evidence suggested that Utu's association with justice wasn't symbolic. It was built into the vocabulary of daily life. Another group of scholars examined the archaeological record, focusing on temple design, administrative buildings, and the physical layout of cities. They noticed that structures associated with legal activity consistently featured open spaces and carefully aligned entrances that allowed sunlight to enter. These designs weren't random. They reflected a belief that legal matters required transparency. Utu's presence influenced architecture as much as it influenced stories. The deeper researchers explored the past, the more they realized that the search for the first lawgiver wasn't about identifying a single person or deity. It was about understanding how people learned to trust one another in communities that kept growing larger. Fairness emerged from these relationships, and Utu, or Shamash, gave shape to that fairness. His movement across the sky represented consistency. His role in myths represented judgment. His temples represented spaces where clarity guided decisions. Some scholars believe the idea of a sun-linked lawgiver predated the earliest tablets. They theorized that long before cities developed writing, early communities used the sun as a marker for settling disputes. They pointed to traditions in other cultures where people swore oaths under daylight, believing that the sun punished dishonesty. These parallels suggested that the connection between light and truth wasn't unique to Mesopotamia. It was a natural association that developed independently across the ancient world. This broader perspective opened new avenues of research. Scholars compared the myths of Utu with those of other solar deities. They found similarities in how these gods represented order, consistency, and fairness. They concluded that the human desire for justice often took the shape of sunlight. People needed something dependable to guide them. The sun provided that. Utu simply became the Mesopotamian expression of this universal instinct. Modern skeptics sometimes approach these ideas with caution. They warned against projecting modern concepts onto ancient societies. They reminded researchers that fairness in early cities wasn't the same as fairness today. Laws could be strict, hierarchical, and difficult, but even they acknowledged that the presence of Utu softened some of these edges. His influence encouraged leaders to think beyond power. It encouraged judges to consider clarity. It encouraged communities to seek understanding rather than conflict. One of the most important contributions of modern scholarship is the recognition that searching for the first lawgiver isn't about finding a single answer. It's about understanding how humans try to organize life in a world shaped by uncertainty. People in ancient Mesopotamia wanted their communities to be stable. They wanted fairness to be possible. They wanted decisions to reflect truth. Whether Utu existed as a literal figure or a symbolic one, he helped create the environment that supported these desires. Scholars also noted that the myths surrounding Utu reveal something deeper about early human values. These myths don't describe a god who imposes rules harshly. They describe a god who observes, understands, and illuminates. This reflects a belief that justice should mirror understanding, not dominance. It suggests that people saw fairness as a process of careful thought, rather than sudden punishment. These values influence the structure of courts, the content of laws, and the behaviour of judges. The debate surrounding Utu's role as a lawgiver continues, not because scholars disagree about his importance, but because his influence is complex. He wasn't merely a deity. He was a presence that guided the way early societies organised themselves. His light shaped how people interpreted truth. His stories shaped how people understood fairness. His temples shaped how people gathered to make decisions. His symbolism shaped how people communicated trust. The skeptics, the scholars, the linguists, the archaeologists all approached Utu's legacy from different angles. But they all acknowledged that the search for the first lawgiver inevitably passes through the world of Utu. The earliest written laws, the earliest administrative practices, and the earliest stories of judgment all revolve around his presence. Whether symbolic or literal, he stands at the crossroads of early civilizations' attempt to create order. And as researchers continued building their understanding of the past, they found themselves looking not only at myths and ruins, but at the everyday lives of the people who once honoured Utu. They saw how the sun guided their routines. They saw how clarity shaped their decisions. They saw how fairness became a habit. This realisation shifted the focus from Utu as a figure to Utu as a principle. They concluded that the search for the first lawgiver is, in many ways, the search for the first moment when people understood that life works better when truth is visible. From that insight, the journey into Utu's story continues, moving toward the deeper questions about how light shaped not only law and daily life, but the entire way ancient societies understood themselves beneath the steady path of the sun. Long before anyone carved calendars into stone or marked the passing of seasons on clay tablets, long before mathematics grew into a language that could describe the world with precision, people already understood that the sun carried order within it. They didn't need formulas or instruments. They needed only their eyes, their patience, and the steady path that unfolded above their heads every day. The movement of Utu, later called Shamash, gave structure to the world long before humans found ways to measure time with accuracy. The ancient stories that formed around him weren't just attempts to explain the unknown. They were reflections of careful observation. They were early attempts to describe patterns that would later become the foundation of astronomy, physics, and the study of time itself. When scholars began looking closely at the myths of Utu, they noticed something interesting. The stories spoke of his consistency. They emphasized his reliability. They described him rising at the same place, following the same path, and setting at the same edge of the world every day. These details weren't artistic embellishments. They were records of what ancient people saw. Before cities had libraries, before scribes etched symbols onto tablets, people looked at the sky and recognized the sun's movement as the simplest form of measurement available to them. They designed their days around it. They shaped their work around it. And eventually they built their understanding of truth and fairness around it as well. Utu became the embodiment of these patterns because he represented the one force in the world that did not vary. Floods came and went, seasons turned, crops rose and fell, but the sun's path remained dependable. Its rising divided night from day. Its height determined the pace of labour. Its disappearance signalled rest. For civilizations first learning how to organise themselves, this consistency was more than comforting. It was a guide. Modern scholars studying these ancient beliefs recognise that much of what people attributed to Utu reflects early scientific awareness. The priests who watched the sunrise from temple rooftops weren't simply performing rituals. They were collecting information. Each morning, they observed how far north or south the sun appeared. They noted changes in its angle. They watched how shadows lengthened or shortened throughout the year. Over time, these observations formed the basis for early calendars. They helped determine planting seasons and harvest times. They influenced the timing of festivals. They shaped how cities planned their yearly tasks. The temples dedicated to Utu often served as centres for these observations. Their design wasn't accidental. They were built with openings that aligned with the sunrise at different points of the year. They were positioned so that the movement of a light across the floor marked the progression of seasons. Priests used these patterns to track the passage of time long before clocks existed. These practices weren't called science then, but they carried the essence of scientific thinking. Careful observation, repetition, and a willingness to draw conclusions from patterns. This connection between myth and measurement is clearest in how the ancient world described Utu's journey. They imagined him stepping into a chariot at dawn, rising over the horizon, travelling across the sky, and descending into the underworld at night. From a modern perspective, the story reads like a poetic explanation of solar motion. But for the people who first told it, the story was a way to express the consistent arc of the sun. The imagery of the chariot wasn't meant to explain the sun's nature. It was meant to show its movement. The details of the myth match the path traced by the sun almost perfectly. Throughout the year, the sun's rising point shifts along the horizon. The ancient observers noticed this. They built markers and sightlines to track it. The temples became tools for measuring not only the day but the larger rhythm of the seasons. When Utu rose farther north, they knew certain plants would grow. When he shifted south, they prepared for cooler days. Without realizing it, they were developing the first forms of solar mapping. Myth preserved the meaning of these observations even when the details weren't written down. Over time, the consistency of Utu's path led to the development of more advanced timekeeping. People began dividing days into sections based on the sun's movement. Shadows cast by tall poles or specially placed markers allowed them to identify midday by the shortest length of the shadow. Before mechanical clocks existed, sunlight served as the first reliable measure of passing hours. This method reflected an intuitive understanding of solar geometry. People didn't describe their observations mathematically, but they understood the relationships involved. As this knowledge advanced, myths about Utu continued serving as a bridge between what people observed and what they believed. The idea that Utu judged human actions mirrored the idea that sunlight reveals what happens in the world. When people began connecting the sun's position to the measurement of time, they saw this as an extension of his clarity. If Utu's movement marked the hours, then the hours themselves followed the principle of truth. Time became a reflection of fairness, just as Utu was. These beliefs strengthened the connection between the sun and moral order. Even the structure of legal proceedings carried hidden scientific influences. Trials often took place outdoors where sunlight could illuminate faces and evidence. This wasn't only symbolic. Human perception is different in daylight. Light allows people to see details clearly. It prevents shadows from hiding expressions or objects. It reduces the chances of misunderstanding. Ancient people didn't describe this in scientific terms, but they recognized the effect. They connected the enhancement of visibility to Utu's influence. His presence made truth easier to detect. Modern researchers interpret this as an early recognition of the relationship between light and clarity of perception. The earliest written laws reflect this connection. They often include instructions about when certain oaths should be taken or when disputes should be examined. These instructions frequently refer to daylight. They reflect a belief that fairness requires visibility. In a modern sense, they express the idea that truth is more likely to emerge in optimal observational conditions. Ancient people didn't use the language of optics, but they understood the principles intuitively. One area where the link between myth and measurement becomes especially clear is in celestial observation. The priests of Utu didn't only track the sun, they tracked the moon, planets, and stars. They studied how these bodies moved relative to the sun. Their work formed the foundation of early astronomy. These observations weren't made in a detached scientific context. They were part of temple duties. The priests believed that understanding the sky helped them understand Utu's role more fully. If Utu governed the movement of the sun, then the entire sky needed to be observed. This belief encouraged long-term data collection. As centuries passed, the collection of sky observations grew into a sophisticated system. Priests recorded eclipses, solstices, equinoxes, and unusual celestial events. They noticed patterns that repeated over generations. These records helped later mathematicians develop calculations for predicting solar and lunar movements. The scientific value of these observations is undeniable. Without intending to create a scientific discipline, the priests of Utu laid the groundwork for future astronomers. Modern researchers studying these ancient observations often find themselves impressed by the accuracy achieved without advanced equipment. The alignment of temples, the positions of markers, and the recordings of astronomical events all demonstrate a deep understanding of the natural world. The myths preserve the cultural significance of these observations, and the measurements preserve the scientific structure. Together, they formed a bridge between belief and calculation. Another area where science is hidden within the mythology of Utu lies in the understanding of seasonal cycles. The Sumerians recognized that the sun's movement changed gradually throughout the year. They tied agricultural tasks to these shifts. Planting, harvesting, irrigation, and storage all depended on predictable patterns. Utu's journey through the sky helped them understand these patterns. His movement wasn't only symbolic, it was the foundation of their agricultural calendar. When they described him travelling through the underworld at night, they were expressing an early understanding of the daily cycle. When they described his position at different times of the year influencing the behaviour of gods and humans, they were describing the effects of seasonal change. Modern readers interpret these myths as stories, but when scholars analyse them closely, they see embedded within them the earliest expressions of environmental awareness. This blending of myth and measurement didn't diminish the spiritual significance of Utu. Instead, it strengthened it. People saw their observations confirmed each day. They saw the seasons shift predictably. They saw the world behave in ways that matched their stories. This consistency made Utu's presence feel undeniable. It made the connection between the sun and fairness feel natural. The same force that governed the sky governed human life. The reliability of sunlight became the foundation of moral and scientific understanding. As later civilizations inherited these stories, they built upon the scientific parts. Babylonian astronomers refined solar measurements. They developed mathematical models for predicting eclipses. They divided the day into hours more precisely. They tracked the movement of planets with increasing accuracy. All of this work grew from the foundation laid in earlier times. The myth of Utu didn't restrain scientific progress. It encouraged it. It gave people a reason to observe the sky carefully. It made the heavens feel structured rather than chaotic. Skeptics sometimes argued that these later developments had little to do with the myths. They believed that scientific progress occurred independently. But even these skeptics acknowledged that the myths provided motivation. They inspired people to look at the sky. They encouraged them to record observations. They gave meaning to patterns. In a practical sense, the myth of Utu made the sky important. Without that cultural importance, the long-term accumulation of data might not have occurred as consistently. Some scholars focused on how myth helped preserve scientific knowledge across generations. In cultures without widespread literacy, stories carried information that couldn't be written down. The myth of Utu preserved the idea that the sun's path was important. It preserved the idea that sunrise and sunset mattered. It preserved the idea that seasons followed predictable cycles. These details allowed scientific knowledge to survive even during periods when writing was rare or disrupted. The relationship between myth and measurement also appears in the way ancient people described fairness. They believed truth could be measured. They believed dishonesty could be detected. They believed justice followed patterns just as the sun did. This mindset influenced the development of law. It encouraged people to treat decisions as something that could be clarified, not something that needed to be guessed at. The belief that fairness followed natural principles helped shape the earliest legal systems. Modern scholars studying these beliefs note that the idea of measurable truth aligns with scientific thinking. Science relies on repeatable patterns. Law in the ancient world began doing the same. Judges didn't rely on personal whim. They relied on procedures that reflected natural order. The connection between Utu's steady path and the steady handling of disputes became part of the fabric of city life. Law followed rhythm. Rhythm followed the sun. The stability of Utu became the stability of civilization. As cities adopted more advanced methods of tracking time, they incorporated these developments into temple rituals. Priests used sundials, water clocks, and shadow markers. These tools represented a shift from observation alone to active measurement. But even as technology improved, the symbolism of Utu remained. People still believed that these instruments were extensions of his clarity. The tools didn't replace the myth, they embodied it. Many modern researchers studying these tools recognize that they represent an early form of scientific instrumentation. They were calibrated through repeated observation. They were tested against natural patterns. They were refined through practical use. The development of these tools demonstrates that ancient people weren't simply observing the sun. They were experimenting, they were verifying, they were creating a system that resembled early scientific methodology. Even the architecture of cities reflected this blending of myth and measurement. Streets often aligned with sunrise. Buildings faced east. Public spaces were oriented toward the path of the sun. These architectural choices had practical benefits, such as maximizing daylight or regulating temperature. But they also carried symbolic weight. Aligning structures with the sun aligned society with the principle of clarity. Modern researchers examining these alignments often describe them as early forms of astronomical planning. As the connection between myth and science deepened, Shamash became more than a symbol. He became a reminder that understanding the world required both observation and interpretation. Ancient people didn't separate these ideas. They saw myth as a way to express the meaning behind measurements. They saw measurement as a way to understand the behavior of the gods. This unity created a worldview where science and spirituality supported each other instead of conflicting. Modern scholars often debate the extent of scientific awareness in the ancient world. Some argue that ancient people understood more than they could express. Others argue that myth filled the gaps where measurement couldn't reach. But regardless of the interpretation, the evidence remains clear. The story of Utu preserved fragments of scientific insight that helped shape early civilization. Even today, when people read the stories of Utu's daily journey, they can see the early understanding of solar motion. When they read about the temples, they can see the beginnings of astronomy. When they read about legal practices, they can see the early adoption of rational procedures. The myth of Utu isn't merely a record of belief, it is a record of observation woven into culture. This relationship continues to interest researchers because it shows how early civilizations didn't simply accept the world as mysterious. They tried to understand it. They used the tools available to them: myth, measurement, ritual, and daily experience. And at the center of this effort stood the sun, steady as ever, rising and setting as it always had. As modern study continues, the story of Utu shows how early humans bridged the gap between what they saw and what they believed. They turned a daily phenomenon into a symbol of fairness. They turned careful observation into the earliest forms of science. They turned the path of the sun into the structure of the world they built. And with that steady progression through time and meaning, the story moves toward the quiet understanding that Utu's influence didn't fade with the ages. It lingered, shaping not only ancient life, but the way people would later understand the connection between clarity, order, and the steady illumination that has always guided the world from the moment dawn first touched the land. Long after the last temple dedicated to Utu crumbled under the weight of sand and time, long after the final scribe copied his name onto a clay tablet, long after empires rose and disappeared into dust, something about him remained quietly present in the world. His temples faded, but the light they honoured did not. His stories softened, but the patterns they described continued. The ancient people who once watched for him at dawn would not recognise today's cities or languages, but they would recognise the way people pause when sunlight enters a room. They would recognise how morning still feels like a beginning. They would recognise how clarity still carries a certain weight. The presence of Utu never fully left the world, because the rhythms he represented still shape the way people move through their days. Although the old myths are no longer spoken in crowded marketplaces or recited during rituals at sunrise, their influence lingers in quiet ways. People may not greet the dawn with offerings anymore, but they still feel something shift when the first light stretches across the horizon. They may not picture a god stepping into a radiant chariot each morning, but they still describe mornings as fresh starts. They still associate daylight with understanding. They still feel safer when they can see what surrounds them. These instincts mirror the beliefs that once guided the earlier cities. They reflect how deeply the idea of a reliable sun has settled into human nature. The ancient people who shaped the stories of Utu didn't separate the physical sun from the meaning it carried. They saw no conflict between observation and imagination. They trusted the light because it revealed the world as it is. They trusted the myth because it revealed the world as it feels. That combination created a cultural foundation that stretched far beyond the borders of Sumer. It touched Babylonia, Assyria, the Levant, Anatolia, and regions still farther from the land where Utu's earliest temples rose. And even after those civilizations changed, merged, or disappeared, the underlying belief persisted. Sunlight helps people understand. Modern life may be filled with clocks, artificial lights, and digital images, but the body and mind still respond to daylight with the same calm recognition, felt by the earliest farmers standing beside irrigation canals. The rhythms of morning and evening still structure human behaviour. People still wake more easily when light filters through a window. They still think more clearly when they step outside during the day. They still feel uncertainty more deeply in the dark. This isn't superstition. It is a response shaped by centuries of alignment with the sun. Utu's presence, once described through stories, now lives quietly in biology. Scientists studying human behaviour often note how strongly light affects mood, memory, and decision-making. They describe how daylight resets internal clocks, sharpens focus, and provides a sense of grounding that prevents thoughts from drifting too far into confusion. When ancient people told stories about Utu offering clarity, they were describing something they felt directly. They didn't have scientific vocabulary, but they understood the relationship. The myth preserved it. The ritual honoured it. And although modern explanations differ, the effect remains the same. People still rely on the sun to separate what is confusing from what is clear. They look to morning light when they need to think calmly. They seek sunlight when they feel overwhelmed. They feel steadier when they step outside and let the day touch them. This quiet instinct traces back to a world that trusted the sun not only as a source of life, but as a source of understanding. Utu's ancient presence continues in the way people instinctively connect brightness with truth. The old stories also emphasize fairness, describing Utu as the figure who revealed dishonesty and supported the innocent. Although the modern world no longer attributes legal decisions to celestial deities, the underlying principle remains. Courtrooms are still designed to be well lit. Trials still rely on transparency. Legal systems still strive for clarity. Even the language used to describe justice echoes the ancient values. Truth comes to light. Facts are illuminated. Motives are revealed. These phrases mirror beliefs shaped thousands of years ago. They reflect how deeply the idea of a sun-linked morality settled into human culture. This influence appears in ordinary life as well. People seek honest conversations in well-lit spaces. They trust someone more when they can see their face clearly. They value relationships where misunderstandings are brought into the open. These instincts follow the same logic that guided the earliest myths. Utu was believed to help people see each other clearly. Today, people rely on transparency to maintain trust. The ancient principle remains, even if the name has changed. When early city builders aligned streets, courtyards, and temples with the path of the sun, they were shaping their lives around a rhythm that still influences modern architecture. Many buildings today still face east, or use natural light to create a sense of openness. People prefer homes with windows that catch the morning sun. They design workplaces that allow daylight to soften long hours. These choices aren't religious, they are instinctual. They reflect the same understanding ancient cultures held, that light supports clarity of thought and steadiness of spirit. The myth of Utu also expressed something deeper, something about how humans understand their place in the world. People saw his daily journey as a reminder that life continues in cycles. Hardships pass, nights end. Confusion fades when daylight returns. Even without the myth, people still rely on this rhythm. They look to new days as opportunities for renewal. They find comfort in the repetition of sunrise. They trust that time offers perspective. These beliefs continue shaping the way people navigate grief, uncertainty, or disappointment. The ancient understanding that morning brings clarity still rises within them. Modern scholars studying the influence of solar deities often describe how early mythology preserved practical wisdom. Utu's stories reminded people that the world follows patterns. They encouraged patience. They encouraged reflection during moments of difficulty. Today, people still rely on these ideas. Even if they use different phrases, they talk about waiting for the right moment. They talk about giving things time to settle. They talk about needing a new perspective in the morning. These expressions echo ancient meaning. They show how deeply the human mind responds to the cycle of light. Even the concept of fairness, which shaped so much of Utu's story, continues to influence modern culture. People believe decisions should be made carefully. They expect honesty from leaders. They rely on open communication in communities. These expectations extend far beyond the boundaries of any ancient civilization. They reflect a shared human desire for clarity. Utu's myth provided a model for this desire. It offered an early representation of fairness in a world still learning how to structure itself. Modern systems may differ in their complexity, but their foundation still follows the same principle. Fairness grows where truth is visible. The influence of Utu also appears in more subtle ways. When people speak of enlightenment, awakening, or seeing things clearly, they echo ancient associations between light and understanding. When they describe someone as a guiding light, they reflect the same belief that guidance comes from illumination. These metaphors are so common that they often go unnoticed, yet they reveal how deeply the link between sunlight and clarity is embedded in language. Even in cultures far removed from ancient Mesopotamia, the same imagery persists. It is part of human expression, shaped by millennia of watching the sun rise. The myth also preserved the understanding that clarity should be shared. Utu didn't offer guidance only to kings or priests. His light touched everyone equally. This created a belief that fairness belongs to everyone. Modern ideas of equality reflect that same foundation. People believe that knowledge should be accessible. They believe that justice should be impartial. These beliefs didn't originate from one story alone, but Utu's presence helped reinforce them. His path across the sky served as a reminder that clarity wasn't reserved for a chosen few. It belonged to anyone who looked toward the horizon. Even the practice of seeking truth by looking at small, overlooked details has roots in the ancient worldview shaped by Utu. People learn to notice changes in shadow length, the shifting position of the sunrise, and the signs hidden within daily life. Today, careful observation remains central to scientific inquiry, problem-solving, and decision-making. Whether someone is studying the natural world or trying to understand their personal situation, The process begins with clarity. The old myth reminded people that understanding emerges when the world is viewed patiently. Modern thought continues that process. The ancient scribes who wrote about Utu believed that knowledge gained through careful observation had value beyond the moment it was discovered. They recorded details so future generations could benefit. In that sense, Utu's influence supported the development of collective memory. Today, people continue to rely on records, data, and shared information to understand the world. They build knowledge generation by generation, much like the ancient priests who watched the sunrise day after day. Clarity accumulates, it shapes the future. The myth captured this process through the image of a god whose light touched every generation equally. Modern life moves faster than anything the ancient world could imagine. Days blur together, and artificial lights extend the night far beyond its natural boundaries. Yet even in this environment, the human body and mind still respond to the sun as they once did. People feel grounded when they step outside into daylight. They feel restored when they catch the first light after a long night. They feel a sense of continuity when the sun rises in the same place it has risen for thousands of years. These responses reveal how deeply the ancient understanding of the sun still lives within them. People today may speak of the sun in scientific terms, describing nuclear fusion, electromagnetic radiation, and the mechanics of the solar system. But these explanations don't diminish the sense of steadiness the sun provides. They simply add detail to an instinctive understanding that existed long before science emerged. The ancient people who told stories of Utu were not wrong in how they felt. They were describing the world through the language available to them. The meaning behind their stories remains relevant because it reflects a universal truth. Clarity comes from light. The influence of Utu also appears in the structure of time itself. Weeks, months, and years all trace back to celestial patterns. Even if modern calendars are more refined, the underlying rhythm remains. People still celebrate beginnings with the rising sun on New Year's Day. They still gather outdoors during solstices. They still align their routines with morning and evening. These practices aren't religious in origin anymore, but they reflect a connection older than any written tradition. The sun continues to organize life, just as it did in the earlier cities, when people experience moments of insight. Those rare seconds when confusion fades and understanding settles gently into place, they often describe it as something becoming clear. This phrasing reflects the same belief ancient people held, that truth reveals itself in light. Whether the clarity comes from careful thought, time, or a shift in perspective, it mirrors the experience of watching the horizon brighten. Utu's influence persists in the way people describe their inner world. Even when people speak of hope after difficulty, they often frame it in terms of dawn. They describe new beginnings as new mornings. They speak of a new day as a chance to realign themselves with what matters. These expressions are more than metaphors. They reveal the deep human connection to the cycle of light. They show how strongly the idea of renewal through sunlight has shaped human understanding. The ancient myth captured this feeling through Utu's daily journey. Modern people feel it without needing the story. The connection between Utu and fairness also continues quietly in how people think about leadership. They still expect leaders to be transparent. They still value honesty. They still believe that decisions should be made openly. These expectations reflect the ancient belief that leaders should align themselves with clarity. Kings once invoked Utu for legitimacy. Today, leaders rely on public trust, and trust depends on visibility. The old principle remains even if the language has changed. Modern people also seek reassurance in the same way ancient people once did. They step into sunlight during difficult moments. They use natural brightness to clear their thoughts. They find calm in watching the sky shift from night toward day. Even when they don't consciously think about ancient traditions, the instinct remains. It reflects how deeply the cycle of light shaped human behavior. The myth of Utu captured that instinct and preserved it through generations. The old temples of Utu may be silent now, their rooftops no longer crowded with priests watching the eastern glow. But the meaning behind those rituals continues in the way people greet each new day. They may not stand in organised groups, they may not recite ancient hymns, but they still experience the same quiet moment when the world brightens and everything feels slightly more understandable. That moment remains one of the most familiar experiences humans share across cultures and centuries. The ancient sun god still rises within people, not because the old myth survived, but because the patterns they described continue shaping daily life. The instinct to seek clarity persists. The calm that comes with morning persists. The search for fairness persists. The desire for understanding persists. These forces are older than writing, older than temples, older than civilization. They follow the same rhythm that guided the earliest people standing along the rivers of Mesopotamia, watching the sky brighten and feeling a steady presence that needed no introduction. And as long as human life continues following the cycle of light and shadow, the essence of Utu's influence will continue rising within people, steady as the dawn, shaping how they see the world without needing his name to be spoken ever again.